Me and a Guy Named Elvis, My Lifelong Friendship with Elvis Presley, by Jerry Schilling, with Chuck Crisafulli. Read by William Dufresne. Copyright 2006 by Jerry Schilling. All rights reserved. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Gotham Books and was produced in the year 2006 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Author's Note, read by Jerry Schilling.
I wouldn't want to speak for Elvis Presley and tell you that I was his best friend, but I can tell you this, he was my best friend. I met Elvis when I was just a boy and he was a teenager. I met him on one of the last weekends before he became Elvis, when he was simply a truck driver who did some singing on the side. I knew him for 23 years, and in those years I grew up with him, lived with him, worked for him, learned from him, laughed with him, and shared one amazing experience after another with him. Elvis was the first rock and roll superstar, and he became one of the world's biggest movie stars. But I didn't know him as a star. I knew him as a friend. In writing this book, my hope has been to present Elvis not as the larger-than-life figure known around the globe, but as simply a very real and quite remarkable human. That's important to me because as Elvis has become an icon and a figure of legend, I think an appreciation of his humanity's been lost. Viewing Elvis as some kind of rock and roll superhero doesn't do justice to his very human struggle, his talent, his life, or his legacy. He was my friend, and this book is, above all, a story of friendship. The book is also a personal history, and as such, it's a work of memory. Sifting through 6 decades worth of memories has been no easy task, but whenever possible, efforts have been made to ensure that the history part of this personal history is accurate. My life's history is very much interwoven with Elvis's, and much of his life has been extensively documented. So if it was possible to look up or double-check a who, what, when, or where, I have done it. Documents don't often capture the more personal moments of life, though, and that's where memories must be sorted out. In thinking back on my life and experiences, I've tried to balance the way I remember things now with the way I might have experienced them at the time. I've tried to be as honest as possible about how and why things happened, and have tried to resist the temptation to describe a past I might have wished for rather than the one I experienced. The places, people, and events of this book are real, as I remember them. No scenes have been invented, no characters made up, and the timeline of events reflect a real chronology. The dialogue people speak in these pages may not be verbatim transcription, but always reflect the words I remember hearing. In just a couple of cases, when it wasn't possible to contact someone from my past, I have changed the name in deference to the sensitivity of the situation described. People have been making up all kinds of stories about Elvis since his first record came out, and in the years since his death, the stories have become so big that my friend's very real life has often been obscured or ignored. In putting this book together, I have discovered over and over again that with Elvis, the truth is always the best story of all.
Chapter 1. If I Can Dream. July 11, 1954, began as a hot, lazy Sunday, just another sticky summer day in North Memphis, and I was a scrawny 12-year-old kid living at the little brick duplex my father rented on Breedlove Street, looking for some way to fight off the boredom of one more stretch of sweltering afternoon. My father worked long shifts at the Firestone factory, and that Sunday, his day off, he was sleeping in. My closest friend, the kid next door, Wayne Martin, was off somewhere on an outing with his family. It looked like I was going to be on my own for the day, so I decided to kill some time by wandering over to Guthrie Park. The park was maybe a half-mile from my daddy's place, down Chelsea Avenue, an open field of scraggly grass and dusty patches laid out in front of an elementary school and a community center. Close to the street was a kiddie wading pool, and a little farther back was a playground, some basketball hoops, and a horseshoe pitch, where I'd learned to enjoy the satisfying clang of a shoe hitting the iron post. As I arrived at the park, the heat of the day was broken by just a hint of breeze drifting over from the Mississippi River. There were a few moms watching their splashing toddlers at the wading pool, and a bunch of older kids out on the grass. I figured I'd walk around to the community center to see if anything half interesting was going on inside. The sky was a hazy summer gray, and I guess I was lost in a bit of a haze of my own. It took me a moment to realize that my name was being called out from across the park. "Jerry! Hey, Jerry! Come here!" It was one of the older kids out on the grass. I recognized him as a local boy named Red West, one of the toughest guys I knew of in North Memphis. Red had been a ferocious all-Memphis football player at Humes High School, and he and his family lived over in a low-income housing project that had the very fitting name Hurt Village. Just knowing a guy was from Hurt gave him a kind of battlefield credibility around North Memphis. Kids in my neighborhood whispered stories about the rough gangs that lurked around Hurt, and how you'd be lucky to get out of there alive if you were ever foolish enough to walk through the projects alone at night. I wasn't sure how Red knew my name, but I figured he might know my older brother Billy Ray, who'd been a pretty strong football player at the private high school he had attended across town. Maybe Red had heard that I was turning out to be a decent wide receiver on the team from my Catholic grade school, Holy Names. Football was the one thing I felt good at. My grades were lousy. I didn't have a lot of friends, but on the Holy Names football field, I was having my first taste of personal success. It didn't really matter how Red knew me, though. I wasn't going to ignore the call. I started over to the group of older boys, trying to throw just a touch of Brando from the Wild One into my walk. "Hi, Red," I said when I got to them, immediately hating the fact that my voice sounded so little, so young, so not Brando. I didn't know the other guys, and I didn't pay too much attention to them. I assumed they were either from Hurt or Humes. Red looked me over hard for a moment. "Jerry, we're a player short of a 6-man game here. You want to play ball?" Of all the things I thought Red might ask me, I hadn't seen this one coming. A chance to play football with Red West and some older kids? Of course I was in. "Sure, Red, I'll play." "All right, then," he growled. "We got a game, full blocking, 2-hand touch. Let's mark out a field." Red and a couple of the guys walked off to figure out the out-of-bounds and goal lines. The other 2 players started warming up by throwing long passes to each other. I kept my eyes on Red, who wasn't a real big guy, but a commanding figure anyway. I had a feeling that with him, even a touch football game was going to be played hard and rough. With the field set, the guys regrouped. "Our ball," said Red. "We'll take Jerry. The rest of you all get back on some defense." 3 of the guys broke away and took positions down the field. I followed Red and another boy, and we leaned together in a tight huddle behind our starting line of scrimmage. Red handed the ball to the other boy. "What's the play, man?" Red asked him. I looked to this guy who Red had just made our quarterback, really looked at him for the first time, and felt a jolt. It was him. There wasn't any one thing about this other guy that hit you right away. He was wearing plain work pants and a white T-shirt. He had blotches of acne on his face and neck. He was kind of on the skinny side. He certainly didn't look any tougher than Red West. But he had a cool I'd never seen before in person. His hair was greased and swept up and back into some very impressive ducktails, the kind of look I wanted as soon as I could get away from the disapproving nuns at Holy Names. You had to put some work into hair like that. And you had to know that it marked you as a probable juvenile delinquent in the eyes of grown-up North Memphis. There was something about the way this guy stood and leaned into the huddle, nonchalant, but no nonsense. Something a little loose, but cocky, too. It looked like he was pulling off the Brando thing without even trying. It had to be him. A couple of nights before, I'd heard a brand new song on the radio. So new the record wasn't even out yet. and had been amazed to learn that the singer was a boy from Humes High in North Memphis. This had seemed astonishing to me. How could a guy from my neighborhood have a song on the radio? And a great song at that, a song that really stood out among all the hot R&B records I'd heard on the show that night. For the last 2 days, I'd been wondering, what guy in North Memphis could make a record like that and get it on the radio? This guy across from me in the huddle looked like he could. "All right now, what's your name, Jerry?" asked the quarterback. "Yeah." "You can catch a football?" "Yeah." "You know how to run a slant?" "Sure." He held his hand out, palm up, and sketched out a play. "You run down the sidelines about 10 yards. Run it easy, not full speed. Red, you go up the middle and button hook. Jerry, when you see Red make his turn, you hit the gas man and run your slant. If you get past whoever's covering you, the ball's coming to you." "Yes, sir." The quarterback's serious expression shifted a bit. He looked at me dead on. He had ice blue eyes, and when he looked straight at you, you felt it. A little twist of half-smile showed up on his face. "Sir?" "Hey, Red, I like this kid's attitude," said the quarterback. "He's all right," said Red, giving me a clap on the back that just about knocked the breath out of me. Red didn't introduce us. I didn't hear his name spoken by any of the other guys, but I didn't have to hear it. I knew who he was. This was the boy from Humes High named Elvis Presley. My mother, Dorothy Schilling, died when I was a little over a year old. She contracted rheumatic fever shortly after I was born and spent most of a year in bed, wasting away. The disease was close to a death sentence back then, but it wasn't always quick. From what I was told later by my grandmother and my aunts, my mother held me as much as she could for as long as she could. But eventually her skin was so sensitive that even the weight of the sheets was painful, and I can only imagine the heartache she must have felt not being able to hold her new baby to her. My mother's dying request to her mother, my Mama Gilkey, was to secure a promise that my brother and I would be loved and taken care of when she was gone. Mama delivered wonderfully on that sad promise. I grew up with a fair amount of confusion about how exactly I fit into my family, but I never doubted for a moment that my Mama loved me with all of her heart. From bits of conversations, little hushed pieces of grown-up talk I'd occasionally catch as a kid, I got the impression that my mom had been happy, pretty, and the kind of person who took care of everybody else first. The peacemaker and pep-talker who made everybody around her feel special. She was one of 7 children, and my father was one of 4 children, and growing up I heard plenty of grumbling and complaining from and about each side of the family. But I never heard anybody say anything mean about my mother. And I don't think that was just because she was gone. I think it was because she was considered a truly special person by everyone who knew her. My father, Bill, grew up in Memphis, and from what I know of my dad's early years, he didn't have much of a childhood at all. He was the oldest son, and when his father abandoned the family, he had to drop out of middle school and start working to help put food on the table. He started at a grocery store, and as soon as he could drive, moved on to a better-paying job as a truck driver. Before he got married, he had landed his job over at the Firestone factory. I think my dad may have spotted my mother on a dance floor at some local Memphis event. Both of them loved to dance, and both of them got into contests when they could, so it makes sense that that's where they crossed paths. I do know that my mother and father got married when he was 21 and she was 19. Within a year, they had a baby boy, my older brother, Billy Ray. My mom had me when she was 26, and at 27, she was gone. My dad had been living a humble working man's dream, a steady job with a few benefits, a beautiful wife, and a couple of baby boys. Suddenly that dream was smashed to pieces. I think that the only thing he could think to do was to keep working as hard as he could to provide for his kids. That meant taking extra shifts at the factory, which meant he couldn't raise us on his own. My brother got sent off to a boarding school a couple hours away in Searcy, Arkansas. Maybe my father figured it would be easier for him to be away from everything that might remind him of our mother. I was moved into my Mama and Papa's house on Leith Street in North Memphis, a neat little white-clapboard home in a poor but well-kept neighborhood. For quite a while as a kid, I assumed I was an only child. I remember telling Mama that I wished I had a brother, and she said, "Why, Jerry, you do. Billy Ray." I hadn't realized that the older kid who showed up for a week at Christmas was actually related to me. Mama and Papa, who made his living as a house painter, opened up their home to me as warmly and as lovingly as they knew how. Sometimes they barely had enough money to put any dinner on the table. White bread and sorghum molasses wasn't an uncommon supper, but they let me, their little grandson, feast on all the doughnuts and sugared-up cinnamon toast my belly could hold. The people around us in the neighborhood were just as poor, and some of the homes weren't much more than the classic southern shotgun shack, but everybody seemed to take pride in the little bit that they did have. Pride in holding a job, pride in having made it through to the other side of a depression and a war. Lawns were well tended, cars were washed and gleaming. Nobody let their little house go too long without a fresh coat of paint. People on Leith Street didn't have much, and knew they probably weren't ever going to get much, but they tried to carry themselves with some dignity. I don't ever remember thinking that I was particularly poor when I was little. I just felt out of place. Other kids lived with a mom and dad. I didn't. I learned to make do with that feeling, though, because it just so happened that every single day I had a looming vision of just how much worse things could be. At the end of Leith, just a stone's throw from my Mama's house, was the chain-link fence that marked off the grounds of the Porter Leith Orphanage. Across a wide field on the other side of that fence, I could see the big, old, Southern Gothic orphanage building itself, looking like that kind of place Dr. Frankenstein might use to hide his laboratory. Way off in the distance you could see a bit of playground that the orphans used, and once in a while you might see a few of them out there. But in all the years I lived on Leith, I never saw those kids playing out on the open field. An uncle would occasionally tease me, "Better behave yourself, Jerry, or we'll send you over to Porter Leith." Other kids might have known that wasn't a real possibility, but I always felt way too close to the edge of those grounds. I walked a couple of blocks out of my way to get to Holy Names, avoiding Porter Leith completely, so as not to take any chances. Mama and Papa's house on Leith Street was the closest I had to a steady home, but I also spent a lot of time bouncing around the homes of all my aunts and uncles, from little houses scattered through North Memphis, to an apartment over a bar and grill near downtown Memphis, to Aunt Jinky and Uncle Bernard's place on Jackson Avenue, the busy thoroughfare that marked the beginning of the North Memphis neighborhoods. Attached to Jinky and Bernard's house was one of my favorite places in the world, John's little kitchen. John was Uncle John Gilkey, my mom's brother, and his place was the finest hamburger joint in North Memphis, popular as an after-school hangout for the kids from Hume's. The little kitchen was a tiny structure with just a few tables and a counter inside. It had twinkling lights and a great jukebox, and always smelled of a heady mix of sizzling grease, the sour tang of empty beer glasses, and the whiff of Clorox off the well-scrubbed floor. John himself had tattoos up and down his arms, and a great sense of humor. And when he had time out of the little kitchen area, he'd sit me on his lap by one of the few tables, sometimes drawing a tattoo or two on my arm with one of his pens. He'd also sneak me an occasional sip of beer along with my burger. John's kitchen was a place where I felt comfortable, even special. But there was one thing about the place that puzzled me. All his customers seemed to enjoy the hamburgers just as much, but the white ones got to come inside through the front door and eat at a counter or at tables, while the darker customers had to come through a side door labeled colored and could only eat standing up at their own little bit of counter. And for some reason, my fun-loving, good-natured Uncle John just always sounded impatient and irritated when he had to deal with those colored customers. The Gilkeys had a great sense of family, and a lot of the aunts and uncles would often get together at the end of the work week to enjoy a dinner of Uncle John's burgers and then watch the Friday night fights on Bernard and Jinky's TV. I spent less time with my dad's side of the family and was a little less comfortable in those homes. Looking back, I realized that both sides of the family lived within a couple of miles of each other, and everybody was working hard to make ends meet. But the Schillings had made it up to solid little brick houses with the fancy three-pillar porches, while the Gilkeys lived in little wood houses with cement slab porches. To my eyes, that seemed like the difference between mansions and shacks. I was generally treated well throughout my childhood, but I think I also knew that all that shuffling from home to home wasn't quite right, and I could sense that I didn't really belong in any one place. I was always sharing someone else's room and someone else's toys. I remember one night, as I was falling asleep at Mama's house, I heard her out in the kitchen talking to one of my aunts. "I love Jerry like he was one of my own," she said. I felt a shiver go through me, and I curled up a little tighter in the blankets. I thought I was one of her own. My insecurities weren't helped by the fact that I was a sickly little kid. Maybe it was all those donuts and cinnamon toast, but I just never seemed to be healthy for any decent stretch of time. I had headaches, earaches, and stomach aches so bad that there were weeks when I just didn't get out of bed. My dad had signed me up to start first grade at Holy Names after I turned 5. There wasn't any kindergarten back then, but I was so sick and missed so much school that first year that I ended up having to do the grade again. I was little, but not so little that I didn't understand that I had flunked first grade. My first experience with academics was an experience of failure, and that didn't do anything to boost my low levels of self-confidence. So, on Leith Street, I spent a lot of time by myself, listening to Mama's great big Zenith floor model radio. I couldn't get enough of the Lone Ranger. But unlike a lot of kids who listened, I didn't imagine myself to be the one with the silver bullets. When the show was over, I'd go out in Mama's backyard, draped in ceremonial battle wash rags, pretending to be Tonto. I'd climb up in the big apple tree there and sit for hours, staring out at North Memphis and wondering which direction the Lone Ranger was going to ride in from. Throughout my childhood, I sometimes stayed with my father on weekends and through the summers, but in that summer of 1954, I moved in with him for good. It wasn't an easy transition. At my grandparents' and aunts' and uncles' houses, I'd been allowed to do as I pleased, but Daddy had rules he expected me to follow. Chores had to get done, and vegetables had to be eaten. My father wanted to do everything in his power to get me strong enough and smart enough to make something of myself, but at the time I didn't appreciate that kind of concern at all. I was angry that my dad was the sort of guy who would waste my Saturday morning to take me to the dentist. Years later, it dawned on me that in a part of town where there were plenty of crooked, toothless smiles, he was the sort of guy who would give up his own day off to get his kids' teeth taken care of. My father worked at the nearby Firestone factory, a place with smokestacks that towered over that part of town. He worked a lot of double shifts, but off the factory clock and on his own time, he was a sharp dresser and a great dancer. And being able to get out on the town on Fridays and Saturdays was a big deal for him. On weekends, he and his younger brother, my Uncle Joe, headed out to the local nightclubs, where they might find some pretty girls to dance away their worries with for a while. So, when I'd stayed at my father's house in the past, I'd often ended up with the house to myself. Back then, in that part of town, hiring a babysitter for a boy my age would have been an unthinkable waste of money, the kind of thing rich people did. After I turned 9, my father had considered me old enough to be left alone while he went out. I liked being given that responsibility, but the truth was that, at 9, it didn't take much to put me in a state of fear. There'd be strange creaks in the floorboards, loud knocks from the pipes, and shadows in the hallway, all of which could get the worst parts of my imagination working. Even the breeze rustling the bushes and trees outside could start to sound a little spooky. With a few rumbles from the occasional thunderhead rolling up the Mississippi River and a flash of lightning or two, I would end up just plain terrified. Deep down, I always knew that if there were any kind of real emergency, help was close by. Wayne Martin, his mother, and his Aunt Bee lived right next door, and I had relatives a few blocks away in almost every direction. And no matter how loud the floor creaked and how hard the pipes knocked, I always eventually fell asleep and lived through the night. At age 12, living at my daddy's house full-time, I wasn't so easy to scare anymore, and I discovered something that made my nights alone in that little house something I looked forward to. In my bedroom, on the dusty chest of drawers, right by the side of the heavy wooden bed, was the one thing in that plain little room that really sparkled. The only thing that hinted at a world of excitement outside. My bright white, plastic, battery-powered, silver-tone radio. It was a beauty, with a molded grill over its speaker, 2 great big knobs for the tuning and the volume, and a giant slash of a red needle to tune in your station. Sometimes in the afternoons and evenings I moved the needle around to pull in broadcasts of The Shadow, The Lone Ranger, or the Fibber McGee and Molly Show. But 6 nights a week, from 9 to midnight, that needle was locked into place at the far left side of the dial at 560 WHBQ, Dewey's station. Dewey Phillips was a half-crazed, speed-talking wild man of a disc jockey who had become the hottest thing on late-night radio in Memphis. His show, Red, Hot, and Blue, played an inspired mix of R&B records, country boogie, hardcore blues, pure gospel, and a few love songs from the silkiest of harmony groups. For good measure, he might toss in a lesser-known tune from a big pop act of the day. Spend a night with Dewey and you might hear Ruth Brown's Mama, He Treats Your Daughter Mean, a new cut by the Clovers, then Johnny Ace singing Pledging My Love, followed by Hank Ballard and the Midnighters knocking out Work With Me Annie. You might even get a Dean Martin B-side followed by Sister Rosetta Tharp's Strange Things Happening Every Day. "Yee-gaw!" Dewey would holler. "You just roll a wheelbarrow full of mad dogs, just wheel it right up through the big front doors over there. You get down on the floor and kick your legs up in the air and tell them Philip sent you. You hear me out there? I know you are. Just ain't no 3 ways about it. Ain't that right, Myrtle?" Myrtle, an imaginary cow who served as Dewey's sometime sidekick, would respond with a low, forlorn moo. Wayne next door had tipped me off about Dewey's show, but when I first started listening to him, I could barely understand a thing he was saying. Unlike other radio guys, he didn't seem to be trying at all to smooth out his backwoods Tennessee twang. But when he played the Domino's 60-Minute Man, I was hooked. Neither Wayne or I knew precisely what the man of the title was doing for 60 minutes, but the song had such a feel of crazy fun and happy secrets, and the way the guy with the low voice sang 15 minutes of blowing my top was such a kick that I couldn't wait to hear it again. By that summer of 1954, whenever I had the house on Breedlove to myself, I was listening to Red, Hot, and Blue. Slowly, I got a little better at figuring out what Dewey was talking about. And man, did he talk. He talked right through some of the songs, fumbled his way through ad-libbed advertisements, shouted out updates on local concerts, and dispensed a constant stream of cracked, countrified wisdom. "Hey, good people, Saturday's just around the corner, and don't you forget now, that's payday and bath day." On the regular popular music radio shows, the DJs sounded so smooth, so calm, so dull. Dewey got all worked up and banged his equipment. You could almost hear him breaking a sweat. He was a grown-up, but he was just barely under control. Dewey and his music seemed fun and dangerous at the same time. And if a kid wanted to hear something other than the unexciting flow of hits like those on the Your Hit Parade TV show, if you wanted to hear Laverne Baker, the Drifters, Big Joe Turner, Howlin' Wolf, and laugh all the way through, Dewey's show was the show you tuned into. That is, it was the show you tuned into if you were a white kid. Memphis was also home to WDIA, the first station in the whole country to have a black on-air staff, though the station itself was white-owned. You could also hear some of the same songs Dewey played on some of the WDIA shows, which were jockeyed by the likes of a very young guitar player named B.B. King and bluesman Rufus Thomas. But that was a black station meant for black listeners, and for a white kid, for any white person, to turn that radio needle to 1070 would be doing the unthinkable. In the unquestioningly segregated South, you were never, ever supposed to step over the very clear lines of color. And I knew color was serious business. As a little kid, I'd been spanked for drinking from colored-only water fountains, and had been punished for making the mistake of shooting marbles with some black kids during an outing to Moon Lake. That didn't stop me from listening to WDIA. A lot of the songs were just as great as what was on Red Hot and Blue, and you could hear them in the afternoon, well before Dewey was on. But even as a kid, I could sense there was something very different around the music. A language I didn't quite understand, describing a world I didn't quite recognize. It was, I know now, simply black voices talking about black Memphis, discussing church events, employment opportunities, or putting out calls for action that helped people in trouble find the groups or agencies that could help them. You might even hear a DJ like the Reverend Gatemouth Moore talk about how crazy it was that the local ambulance companies were separated by race. He had seen a white lady die because the black-run ambulance that got to her first wasn't allowed to handle her. Listening to WDIA, I didn't understand the logic behind the color lines of my town any better, but I couldn't help but be aware of them. Dewey didn't seem to care about black music or white music. He liked music that was honest and energetic, unpolished stuff that grabbed and shook you in some indefinable way. And he wasn't sending that music out to white people or black people. He was always calling us good people. Dewey didn't make a listener think about the world this music was pulled from, a hard, tense world of separate drinking fountains and lunch counters, streets that couldn't be crossed, and a whole tangled mix of official laws and accepted habits that kept people fearful and apart. Listening to Dewey, you didn't hear black and white. You just heard excitement. Good music for us good people. That music was intoxicating stuff to a kid like me. All the other grown-ups around town seemed so steadily in control. People went to work, kids went to school, families went to church. The days moved along at the same slow, predictable rhythm. A holiday or a community event might break things up a little, but to me, anyway, there was always something a little sad, even about the supposed good times. At 12, I didn't have any real overview of the world beyond my few blocks of North Memphis, just a vague, achy feeling that sometimes the grown-up world didn't make a lot of sense, and I wasn't sure how I was ever going to fit into it. And while I didn't know it that summer, I wasn't the only kid starting to sense that joyless sameness around us, and as it turned out, there were more than a few of us who desperately wanted to believe that there was something else out there. Something that moved a little faster and wilder. When we found Dewey, we felt like we'd found somebody who understood what we were after. Some of us even took the bolder step of walking down a Home of the Blues, a record store on Beale Street, downtown Memphis's historic strip of neon-lit shops, jazz joints, and nightclubs for an all-black clientele, to buy the music we heard Dewey play. Or we'd head over to Poplar Tunes, a record shop at the edge of the white part of North Memphis, to get the songs we wanted. I didn't even have a record player, but I'd gone out and bought a few 78s, feeling like a secret agent on an extremely perilous mission. I was earning pocket change that summer delivering circulars for a little market down the street from my dad's house, and just about every cent I earned eventually got spent at Home of the Blues or Poplar Tunes. Shortly after I started listening to Dewey Phillips, and right after I'd bought my own first few records, I learned that the music he played could have a very frightening effect on people. I'd become friendly with a couple of boys on the Holy Names football team, a pair of brothers named Doolittle, and was impressed to hear that they had their own record player. Their mother was a nice lady who was very involved with the school's PTA and who was always willing to carpool us football players around between games and practices. One day after a practice, the Doolittle boys asked me if I'd like to spend a weekend at their house. The way I lived, I was excited about spending a weekend with anybody outside of the family loop. I said a quick yes and went home to pack up. There wasn't much to pack, but thinking about a weekend of unlimited access to the Doolittle boys' turntable, I made sure to bring my stack of 4 or 5 precious 78s. Mrs. Doolittle came by to pick me up, and before long I was settling in over at the Doolittle home. In the boys' bedroom, I showed them my records and asked if they wanted to hear some music. They did. I think I may have had the McGuire Sisters, Sincerely, and maybe Till I Waltz Again with You by Teresa Brewer. Both acts were pre-Dewey favorites of mine. But I also had a couple of things I'd bought down on Beale Street, songs by Laverne Baker and Ruth Brown, and, most prized of all, my copy of 60-Minute Man. If we had stuck with the McGuire Sisters, things might have turned out differently, but I put 60-Minute Man on the record player and turned it up about as loud as it would go, which on the players back then was not all that loud. The Doolittle boys started smiling and nodding along, and I was feeling pretty big. Those trips to Beale Street had paid off. I'll rock 'em, roll 'em all night long. I'm a 60-minute man. This time, though, the 60-minute man lasted only about 30 seconds. Mrs. Doolittle stormed into the room, went straight for the record player, dragged the needle off the disc, and picked the record up. She wheeled around, and I saw a fury in this lady's eyes unlike anything I'd ever seen before. The nice, sweet, carpooling PTA mom was replaced by a woman almost trembling with rage. In a voice harder and harsher than anything I'd ever heard come out of Mrs. Doolittle, she said, "You're not going to play that nigger music in my house." Then, with a bit of effort, she cracked the record she was holding in half and proceeded to pick up the rest of the collection and break those too, even the McGuire Sisters. "Pack your things back up," said Mrs. Doolittle. Within minutes I was sitting back at home with no more special weekend plans, no chance for a pair of new friends, and no more record collection. From then on I realized that music had a great, deep, and sometimes unpredictable power. And I realized that the R&B records I was beginning to love so much weren't just songs. They were something bigger. They were statements. Statements of what, I wasn't quite sure yet, but as soon as I could save up enough money, mowing lawns, delivering circulars for the local market, I was heading down to Beale Street to buy more records. I never did get invited back to the Doolittle house. In that summer of 1954, I'd been living at my father's place for about a month or so when, one weeknight in early July, Daddy headed out with Uncle Joe and I had the house to myself again. The thunder rumbled outside a couple of times. I couldn't tell if it was getting closer or not. A little after 9, I folded myself up on the big bed and clicked on the Silvertone's volume knob. I put my head back on my pillow and listened as Roy Goodrockin' Brown's Hurry, Hurry, Baby came to an end. "Ah, that's a good old one. Take it from your daddy, O Dewey," said the DJ. There were some sounds of fumbling and crashing, like Dewey had banged into his microphone. "Shoo! Somebody give me a hand with this pea-picking thing." My mind started to drift a bit, and I was vaguely aware of Dewey doing one of his improvised ads for Champagne Velvet Beer and then playing a couple more songs. I may have been thinking about how I was going to fill the long stretch of summer days ahead of me. Then something caught my ear. "Look out, good people," Dewey said. "I got something here that's so good. When I heard this one, I almost swallowed my gold tooth. We got a new record here that ain't even dry yet, and this little number is sung by a fine young man who just 1 year ago received his diploma from Humes High School right up there in North Memphis. How about that?" My head shot up off the pillow. Humes High School was just blocks away from my Mama and Papa's house. From the back of the Holy Names Elementary School playground, you could look right through a vacant lot to the grounds of Humes. My mother and my Aunt Jinky had gone to Humes. My cousin Teddy had just finished his freshman year there. I had it in my head that one day I'd be one of those grown-up-looking kids over at Hume's. Before that moment, to me, the music you heard on the radio didn't seem connected to the real world around us. It existed only as stuff that came out of your radio speaker or that you could buy in the record stores. Once in a while, Dewey might mention that a particular musician was from Memphis, but Memphis was a huge place in my mind. I guess I had some idea that there were musicians in Memphis, but I really had no idea where those people lived, and less idea how they wrote their songs, made their records, and got them to people like Dewey. It was a mystery I really hadn't had much reason to ponder. You simply turned the radio on and you heard music. But now Dewey was saying that a boy, who had to live just blocks away from me, had actually made his own record. Dewey introed the song, saying he himself had heard it for the first time just the day before, courtesy of Mr. Sam Phillips, no relation, I'd learn, over at Memphis Recording Service. It was a cover of an old Arthur Big Boy Crudup tune. I didn't catch the name of the boy from Hume's at first. It was something kind of old-fashioned. The record started playing, and the boy from Hume's High started singing. He sounded great. The music was simple, just a couple of guitars and a plunking bass, but it sounded unlike anything else I'd ever heard. The rhythm was easy-going and driving at the same time. Not quite blues, not quite country. The boy from Hume's High had a voice that was strong, but gentle, too. Right away, he was soaring up to sweet high notes, sounding like it didn't take him any effort at all to get there. That's all right now, Mama, any way you do. He sounded tough at times, and sang with unbelievable confidence, but there was also a little tremble in his voice that kind of pulled you in. The way he sang, you could feel both a little smile and an ache. Whatever secret world of excitement was out there beneath the boring surface of grown-up, day-to-day life, it sounded like this guy from Hume's High had found it. The song was over too fast, and the voice was gone. The voice of a boy from Hume's High. Elvis Presley. That's what Dewey said the singer's name was. I was wide awake now, and I wanted to hear that song again. Dewey must have known there would be some other listeners feeling the way I did, because after a station break, Dewey played the song again. And again. And again. Dewey did that sometimes when he really liked a record, and he clearly liked this one. I think I got to hear that brand new song 6 or 7 times, and it sounded just as fine every time Dewey played it. That's all right. That's all right. Already I liked it even better than 60-Minute Man. But the new record turned out to be only half the thrill of that night's show. After some more fumbling with the mics, Dewey let us know that the boy from Hume's High was sitting right there next to him, right here in the magazine level of the beautiful Chiska Hotel. For some reason, mezzanine was always magazine to Dewey. The boy's song was getting such an enthusiastic response from around town that Dewey had called to get him down to the studio. His mom and dad had gone out looking for him, had finally found him hunched down in a seat in the back of the Suzor No. 2 movie theater, and had brought him straight over to the Chiska to go live on the air with Dewey. I'd be lying if I said I remembered exactly what was said that night by this new singer. But I do remember that hearing Elvis Presley talk had me just as excited as hearing him sing. His speaking voice was kind of high and soft, like his singing voice, but in conversation he wasn't so smooth. You could hear that he was nervous. He was perfectly polite with Dewey, calling him Sir and thanking him for playing the record. He sounded like a nice guy, even a little shy maybe, but always cool. He even sounded good when he stuttered and stammered his way through most of his answers. Kind of made me want to stammer, too. Dewey thanked him for being there, played That's All Right one more time, and then worked his way toward his sign-off. I finally clicked off the Silvertone and lay back down. Maybe Dewey would play the song again tomorrow night. I hoped so, because I wanted to hear it again. And I wanted to hear Elvis Presley talk some more. Most of all, I wanted to meet this boy from Hume's High. I'd had the importance of prayer pretty well drummed into me in my years at Holy Names, but as far as I could tell, it hadn't done me any good. At first, I figured maybe I was just praying wrong. Then I figured maybe I wasn't important enough to have my prayers heard. Finally, somewhere around 3rd or 4th grade, I began to have this sneaking suspicion that the whole system was just another thing the grown-ups said was good for you that didn't really have any discernible upside, like eating your vegetables. This night, though, I decided to give it another shot. I didn't kneel by the bed. I didn't fold my hands or squinch up my eyes. I just lay in bed and stared up at the ceiling. I thought about that boy from Hume's High. As much as I'd heard the song that night, I couldn't quite hum the melody he'd sung. It was already slipping away. But the feeling that song gave me didn't go away. It took me a while to figure out what that feeling was, because it was a feeling I wasn't used to. It was hope. So I threw together a bit of improvised prayer, just for the heck of it. Staring up at the ceiling, hands at my side, I prayed. Look, the neighborhood's not that big. Just let me meet this guy. Please? I already knew that hope was a dangerous thing in North Memphis. It usually just led to more disappointment than if you went through life without it. And I didn't expect that my prayer now, simple as it was, had any better chance of being answered than any previous prayer. But on this sticky summer night, when the sound of the pipes and the floorboards and the thunder had been drowned out by one strong voice from Hume's High, it didn't seem like a little hope and a little prayer could hurt. The breeze had died off in Guthrie Park, and the afternoon air started to feel a little hotter and heavier. We broke from the huddle and got set for the play. As I towed up to the line of scrimmage, I felt pumped and couldn't wait for that ball to come my way. Maybe I should have been nervous playing with older kids, but I knew what I was doing playing football. If I'd come across these guys singing or playing guitars and been asked to join in, I wouldn't have been able to step up. But running a slant and catching a pass, I felt like all those long, hard practices and full pads at Holy Names had prepared me for this particular moment. "Hike!" shouted Elvis Presley. I took off down the sideline, a little above half speed, and when I saw Red begin to turn, I ran as hard as I could up and across the field. Elvis pumped the ball to Red, and when the guys in the backfield stepped toward him, I flew right past them. The quarterback broke to his right and threw. He had an awkward kind of sidearm style, but the ball came my way hard and fast, a spiraled bullet aimed just ahead of where I was running. I got my hands up and out and reeled it in, feeling like there was nothing more natural in the world than to receive a perfect pass from a quarterback who had had his record played on the radio. There wasn't a chance the defenders could catch me, but I kept up the run full speed to the end zone. When I got back to my teammates, I felt the urge to smile, but smiling seemed like something a little kid would do. I kept my game face on. "Nice hands, little man," said Red. He gave me a congratulatory shove. "He's got something," said the quarterback. "We got a game going." I caught a lot more passes on the Guthrie field that Sunday, made a couple of interceptions, too, and got knocked on my ass at least a dozen times. I don't know how long we played, but I would have kept going all night. I didn't have to ask Red, and I didn't hear anybody else say his name, but I knew that in some unfigurable way, my little North Memphis radio prayer had been answered. I had met the guy from Hume's High. I wasn't sure if I should thank God or Dewey Phillips, but here I was in Guthrie Park with Elvis Presley. Outside of listeners to Red Hot and Blue, that name wouldn't have meant anything to anybody in North Memphis on this particular Sunday. Elvis Presley, on that day, was still a 19-year-old truck driver for the Crown Electric Company, a year out of high school and less than a week into a recording career that carried no guarantee of turning into steady work. There wasn't anything about him you could point to that day that really made him look like a star. His hair, though impressively combed, was an average-looking sandy brown, not the dyed jet black that would become so familiar later on. In most ways, he was just another poor North Memphis kid from the government projects over at Lauderdale Courts. But even as he scrapped and blocked and fell and played just as hard as the rest of us, there was something else there. He didn't so much stand out as stand apart. He wasn't just another older kid, not just another tough guy, and not your typical full-of-himself quarterback. It was like he was already the star of his own movie, but he wasn't playing it up. There was only one way in which Elvis's cool looked a little more like comedy. He had grit and determination and could throw a ball, but he was not a natural athlete, not the way Red was. This became very clear whenever Elvis broke into an open-field run. Those loose legs of his seemed to shoot out in every direction at once, like Crazy Legs Hirsch, and it seemed to take him an extra effort just to keep himself moving forward. It occurred to me toward the end of the game that Red and Elvis and the three other older guys didn't really talk to each other like they were any kind of familiar best buddies. They were just getting to know each other that day, too. I don't think anybody said anything about Elvis having been on the radio, but I'd guess that was the icebreaker that had pulled these guys together. I'd later learn that Elvis had been something of a misfit and an outsider during his high school days, and now, with the cachet of a song that had been played on Dewey Phillips's show, he had finally found some guys to hang out with. Elvis's musical talents would eventually bring him just about everything he wanted in his life, but on that weekend, all he wanted was to play football with a bunch of guys, and having his first record out helped make that happen. In fact, I happened to show up at Guthrie Park on probably the last weekend of Elvis Presley's life in which he would have any trouble finding a sixth man for a 3-on-3 football game. At some point, the gray skies got dark enough that the guys just stopped playing. A couple of them gave me a nod and a good game. Elvis and Red started to shuffle toward the community center. I was wondering whether I should seize the moment and blurt out, "I like your song," when Elvis turned back to the rest of us and said, "We'll meet again here next Sunday." The guys nodded and mumbled yes. I nodded too. A couple of days ago, I'd been a lonely kid without much more than a radio to get me through the summer. Now I was standing here in Guthrie Park, feeling like I'd become part of something exciting. There'd be another game next Sunday, and there wasn't any question that I would be there. I'd be ready to play football on Elvis Presley's team. Chapter 2. I Was the One. Music has always had a magic for me. One of my very earliest memories is of the sound of the radio broadcasts of the Grand Ole Opry coming over the set at Mama's house. When I was probably just 3 or 4, it occurred to me that in between the talking parts of the show, the people on the radio were doing something very unusual with their voices. When I asked Mama what it was, she told me, "That's singing, Jerry. The people are singing." From my small perspective, the talking didn't make much sense, but that singing stuff was clear and powerful. I saw that music had a certain power over the adults around me, too. Before I was staying alone at my dad's house, he'd sometimes just take me with him when he went out at night, a deal that saved him the hassle of finding another place to drop me off, and gave me a peek at that secret world of grown-ups having fun. One of my dad's favorite spots was up at the top of the Peabody Hotel, where there was a large ballroom with panoramic views of Memphis and the Mississippi River. The bands up there played the kind of swinging jitterbug dance music my dad loved, and occasionally a top national act like Harry James or Tommy Dorsey would have an engagement there. The walls of the ballroom were black, with tiny lights set up in the ceiling, so you could almost believe you were at a party up in the stars somewhere. I remember sitting happily under tables in that ballroom, sipping away at endless sodas and watching the adults shimmy and shake around the room's sunken dance floor with a kind of smile and a kind of twinkle in their eyes that you just didn't see anywhere else. I loved the sense of peace and calm I got from the music that played during the daily Mass at Holy Names. Of course, I was only Catholic until the last school bell rang. When I went home to Mama, I was part of a Baptist home. I spent 3 years at a Catholic school being the non-Catholic kid, and I couldn't wait until I finally took enough catechism classes to take First Communion with my classmates. As far as my Baptist upbringing went, there wasn't a lot of church-going, but Mama and some of the other people on my mom's side of the family would sometimes take me to weekend revivals, many of them under a pitched tent on the same field in Guthrie Park where I would eventually play horseshoes and football. At a time before television was widespread and when there were nowhere near the kind of leisure time activities available today, a revival wasn't just more church. It was grand spectacle and high-energy entertainment. I remember how the soul-stirring music that played under those tents could get a crowd of adults up off its feet, clapping and shouting together. And sometimes that crowd would get so worked up that the smiles and twinkles in the eyes you'd see around you under the tent weren't really all that different from the ones you'd see at the top of the Peabody. Of course, over at the Doolittle's house, I'd learned that there was some music that elicited a much different reaction, hardly smiles and twinkles. I think the Doolittle episode must have been in the back of my mind when I first heard Elvis's record, because by then I knew that if you found something good, you were better off keeping it a secret. So I didn't tell anybody about the record I'd heard by a guy from Humes High, or that I'd met the guy himself over at Guthrie Park. Not my dad, not Uncle John, not even Wayne Martin. Keeping it all to myself seemed like the best way to keep it special. I figured I'd managed to get lucky with one little prayer. I didn't want to do anything or say anything that might jinx my chances of playing ball again with Red West and Elvis Presley. Also, Elvis himself hadn't made a big deal out of his record. In fact, he hadn't said a word about it. If he was going to keep cool and quiet about it, I'd do the same. I'd only spent half of one afternoon catching his passes, but I guess I already felt some sense of loyalty to this new quarterback of mine. I kept listening, though. Dewey Phillips played That's All Right at least once every night on Red Hot and Blue, and the more I heard the song, the more I kept running through the last moments on that football field. Elvis himself had said he wanted to play again, hadn't he? He meant there at Guthrie same time next Sunday, wasn't that right? And the biggest question of all, he meant for me to be part of the game again, didn't he? By the Saturday after that first game, I guess I was worked up enough that, despite my desire not to jinx anything, I had to tell somebody. I needed a witness. And somewhere that day I crossed paths with Frankie Grisanti, a kid from the Holy Names football team who was a year behind me in school. Frankie was a short, stocky kid, but he was fast and tough as a player, and the few times we talked, I'd found him easy enough to get along with. I was more interested in hanging out with older kids than younger ones, but Frankie had a special connection. His brother, Ronnie, a few years older than me, was Holy Names' dependable brick wall of a center. I didn't tell Frankie about hearing the song, and didn't go into much about meeting Elvis. I just told him that I'd had the chance to play football with older kids from Humes and had had a great time. The older guys had said they were going to play again tomorrow at Guthrie, and if Frankie came along with me, maybe he could play too. It sounded good to Frankie. He said he'd come by my house and we'd go to the park together. Frankie showed up right on time early Sunday afternoon, and we headed down Decatur Street toward Guthrie. When we got to the park, I saw a couple of the older kids from the week before on the field. After all these years, I'm still not sure exactly who was at those first games. I knew Red, but after seeing Elvis, I didn't care who else was there. I walked up toward them and got a couple of nods, relieved to see that at least these guys remembered me. We stood around for a while until we heard some laughs coming from across the field over by the community center. I turned, and sure enough, there he was, walking next to Red, looking just as cool as the last time. I was going to have to use a lot more Brill cream to get ducktails like that. It was when I took a closer look behind Elvis and Red that my spirits sank. There were maybe 6 or 7 older guys ready to play this time. All the guys they needed to play an evenly matched game. Damn, I was going to be knocked off this guy's team after just one game. Red was starting to explain some Guthrie ground rules to the newer guys when Elvis noticed Frankie and me standing there. He took a couple of lazy steps in our direction, checking his grip on the ball he was holding. He pointed the ball at Frankie. "Hey, Penrod, go out for a pass." Frankie took off like a spooked bulldog, pumping his hams faster than I'd ever seen, and Elvis reared back and threw one of his bullets. I hoped that Frankie would do the Holy Name Squad proud and hang on to it. Sure enough, he did, though the force of the ball seemed to actually pick him up in the air and move him a little farther down the field. "That away, Penrod," called Elvis. He started to turn away. I figured I'd better speak to him before the older guys gathered around again and I lost the chance. "Why'd you call him Penrod?" I asked. Just a name I saw in this book I'm reading," he said. He was a year out of school and still reading books, which seemed strange to me. In North Memphis, reading anything other than postcards and the Bible was maybe even more radical than listening to Dewey Phillips. Not only was the guy cool, he was a reader. "You going to run those nice posts again?" Elvis was looking down the field, but he was talking to me. "Sure, I'll run anything you want me to," I said. Maybe I was hoping for a slap on the back, but he just turned to walk away, calling out to one of the older guys across the field. I could see that Elvis Presley wasn't the kind of guy you got to know real well, real fast. I wasn't either, but I had plenty of time. We ended up playing 6-on-6, with both Frankie and me in the game. I'm sure that most of the older guys would have been just as happy not to have younger kids in the game, but somehow Elvis, without ever making much of an issue out of it, kept us included. He was going to be quarterback again. He wanted me to be one of his receivers, and that meant the other team got Frankie to line up against me. He kind of acted like that was just the way it was supposed to be, and nobody else there seemed to have any interest in disagreeing with him. I know that Elvis could just as easily have told us to get lost, but it seemed clear that even though he looked and moved like a rebel, and even though he kept himself just a little apart, a little distant, he didn't have the kind of mean streak I'd seen in other older kids, especially older kids from the projects. From what I knew of Red West, he would have had no problem telling us to get lost, and quick, but Elvis wanted us around. So we were in. Again, it was a great game. Elvis was a little more serious than he had been the week before, running the huddles like a military man. But whenever we pulled off one of his plays, he lit up with a big smile. And those smiles meant a lot, because you didn't see too many of them. There were a few other occasions when he'd let his serious game face slip. If anybody took a particularly awkward fall, got knocked on their ass with a brutal block, or otherwise ended up sprawled in some embarrassing position on the field, Elvis just about doubled over with a rush of laughter. It felt great to laugh along with him. We played that second game at Guthrie, and then a third the next Sunday, and it seemed that the games on that field were going to be a regular part of every weekend. And it seemed that Elvis Presley was going to be a regular part of radio programming. That's All Right kept getting played on Dewey's show, and other shows started picking it up too. It was even being played on WDIA. Pretty soon the record itself was out as a single, and the flip side, a revved-up cover of Bill Monroe's Blue Moon of Kentucky, started getting radio play too. Up in Poplar Tunes, there was a great big hand-painted sign proudly advertising the fact that they had in stock plenty of records by the new local sensation Elvis the Cat Presley, available in 45 or 78. It was also pretty clear that I wasn't the only one excited about the sound and the person of Elvis Presley. At each game that summer, there were a few more guys showing up to play, and increasingly there were groups of people just showing up to watch. I was hearing Elvis's songs on the radio, but he and his band, guitarist Scotty Moore and bassist Bill Black, were starting to make a name for themselves as a live act, too. On July 30, 1954, Elvis played his first major concert in Memphis at the Overton Park Bandshell, being added as a featured attraction to a lineup of country artists that was headlined by Slim Whitman. By the end of the summer, the trio had a regular Friday night gig at a little dance club called the Eagle's Nest. In the fall, Elvis, Scotty, and Bill were stepping up to some big-deal gigs like the Grand Ole Opry and the Louisiana Hayride. And by the end of the year, they were playing shows as far away as Texas. The trio also stayed busy working with Sam Phillips over at Memphis Recording Service on Union Street, and the records that followed their debut, Good Rockin' Tonight, Milk Cow Blues Boogie, proved that the excitement of That's All Right was no fluke. His career was starting to take off, but if Elvis was in North Memphis on a Sunday, he'd pull together another football game. And a Sunday didn't go by that summer that I wasn't hanging around the park, waiting to see if he would show up. I kept thinking the games were getting big enough that they wouldn't want a kid out there, but I always made the cut. Elvis would see me hanging around and maybe toss me the ball while he was warming up, or somehow make it clear that he wanted me to play, though again, not much was ever said. Into the fall of 1954, we were usually playing 6-on-6, and though the teams were generally set, sometimes the rosters got mixed up just to keep things interesting. I remember it felt a little awkward the first time I was on a team playing against Elvis, and since I was well acquainted with his play-calling style, I found myself in the odd position of intercepting Elvis Presley. It felt wrong, but really, really good. At one of those fall games, I received the first open acknowledgement that I was officially a part of Elvis's team. The games were attracting big enough crowds that Elvis thought it would be a good idea for the players to wear jerseys. I showed up at the park one day to find one of the older guys handing out some green sleeveless pullovers, the kind you might wear over a t-shirt in gym class. I thought this might be the moment I'd be pushed out. Nobody would have to say anything, I just wouldn't get a jersey. Elvis made sure I got one. Didn't say, "Welcome to the team," or "Here's for all your great catches." Just tossed a jersey at me and said, "It's a large. Try not to trip over it." I'd heard that he lived with his mom and dad over on Alabama Street by the Lauderdale Courts, but to me, he had a presence that didn't quite fit the streets I was used to. I couldn't imagine Elvis having a job, or taking out the trash, or answering to a mom and dad. It seemed to me that he stepped right out of the radio and into Guthrie Park. But he was a real North Memphis guy, and one day in early 1955, I spotted him on my very block of Breedlove Street. Across the street from my daddy's house, and a couple of houses over, there was a girl a couple of years older than me named Meredith Glass. She listened to Dewey, too, and had a record player, and a couple of times Wayne Martin and I had gone over there to listen to music with her. I remember being very impressed that she had her own copy of 60-Minute Man. Meredith went to Humes High, and somewhere along the way had become Red West's girlfriend. I was sitting in the front room at Breedlove, not doing much of anything, when I happened to notice a beat-up black 40s model car pull up to Meredith's house, a car I immediately recognized as the one Elvis and Red West came to the games in. Sure enough, both of them got out of that car and headed right into Meredith's house. I wanted nothing more than to bolt out the door, dash across the street, and be a part of whatever the older kids were doing over there. But there was no way I was going to make that bold a move. On the field, I could prove myself as a player. Knocking on Meredith's door, I'd just be the little kid from down the street. I waited in the front room, and after a while, Red and Elvis came back out. It looked like they had borrowed a stack of records from Meredith. They drove off, and Breedlove went back to being the same boring old street. But it was nice to know that Elvis really was out there, living his life in my part of the city. Maybe nobody else on the block cared but me and Meredith, but Elvis was a part of our neighborhood. That was pretty cool. With That's All Right climbing up the charts and all sorts of press surrounding his live appearances, Elvis Presley was on the rise. But it would be a mistake to think that everybody that heard him or saw him in those early days liked him. Mrs. Doolittle wasn't the only person in Memphis concerned with the mixing of the races or the threat of the growing black population. One of the meanest nuns at Holy Names used to try to scare us by saying that because so many whites had embraced the immorality of birth control, the blacks would take over the earth. though they hadn't yet managed to infiltrate Holy Names' all-white student body. Those kinds of feelings were prevalent, and to a lot of people, Elvis Presley was nothing more than white trash playing black music. Some of the early press reports treated Elvis with interest and enthusiasm, or at least treated him as a phenomenon worth taking note of, but the general feeling of conservative, old-school Memphis was that the city should be more embarrassed by Elvis than proud of him. From the early concert clips we see these days, it might be assumed that even if old-school Memphis didn't get Elvis, the kids did. But that's not quite true either. Memphis kids were not automatically Elvis fans. He was a poor white boy, and that was something that a lot of people in Memphis were used to looking down on, the thinking being that blacks were poor because that was just their nature, but whites who were as poor as blacks were truly despicable. A lot of the kids who'd been used to looking down at somebody like Elvis weren't going to suddenly change their minds because he had a popular record out. If anything, they disliked him more now because they had something to be jealous about. These were the early days of what would soon be called the youth culture. And for all the kids who got excited about the first sounds of rock and roll, there were at least twice as many who thought it sounded just plain horrible. Those of us excited about Elvis were part of an underground that a lot of our generation still didn't want anything to do with. The reaction of my brother Billy Ray to Elvis was probably pretty typical of the time. When he found out about my ongoing participation in the Guthrie Park Games, Billy Ray, a serious, clean-living, hard-working athlete, could not disguise his utter contempt when he asked, "Why are you always hanging around that guy?" As Elvis started to get bigger and bigger, I had a few up-close views of the split feelings toward him. I saw the positive side in a significant way on February 6, 1955, the day I became an official teenager, and the day of Elvis's first big show at the premier concert venue in Memphis, Ellis Auditorium. My birthday treat to myself was to spend some of my hard-earned paper delivery money on a pair of tickets to both the 3 p.m. and 8 p.m. shows at Ellis. It was my first chance to see Elvis Presley as a performer on stage. Because of his success at the Louisiana Hayride shows, Elvis was finding himself booked on some bills with top country artists, as he was at these shows. The flyers around town listed Farron Young, Martha Carson, and Ferlin Husky as the headlining acts, and had Memphis's own Elvis Presley down at the bottom of the bill. Those other acts didn't mean anything to me. I was there for Elvis. Most people inside the auditorium seemed to feel the same way, too. There was a buzz and an energy, not to mention a fair amount of female squealing, that couldn't be mistaken for anything but Elvis-generated excitement. I don't remember much about the Farron Young or Ferlin Husky performances, except that the crowd was as attentive as could be expected and clapped where it was supposed to. It was when Elvis took the stage that the place just about exploded. I'd never heard such a human-made roar as Elvis, in loose slacks and a fancy tailored jacket, strapped on his guitar and took his place in front of a mic, flanked by Scotty with his guitar and Bill with his bass. But as soon as they started playing, and as soon as Elvis started moving, the energy that came off that stage was even bigger than anything the crowd was throwing back at it. For a guy who hadn't been on that many big stages yet, and for a guy with so much wild energy to burn, he handled the show like a real pro, moving around and working the crowd masterfully, making sure that everybody got plenty of what they'd come for. This guy wasn't just a kid with some records out. He was an entertainer. I'd heard Elvis sing on record and on the radio, and I'd seen him move on a football field, but the musicality and physicality I saw come together on that stage was something else. I was already impressed by the way the guy walked and the way he threw a football, and I liked his records. But it was a shock to see the way he threw himself so completely into the music as a stage performer. Those crazy legs shook and trembled. His arms pinwheeled. He tossed his body around like he was nothing more than a rag doll with a great head of ducktails. And he treated his mic stand like it was the object of passionate seduction. sometimes holding it close with tenderness, sometimes just dragging it across the stage like a worked-up wild man dragging his mate off to the nearest cave. His moves were more outrageous than anything I'd ever seen or heard of, but they were also perfectly timed and executed. It had an effect on me. I hadn't felt this much adrenaline pumping through me since I'd seen Rocky Marciano knock out Joe Louis on the Friday night fights over at Aunt Jinky's. People have been calling Elvis the hillbilly cat. What I saw up on stage was a hungry tiger. The Elvis crowd loved every minute of it. Everything the records had promised, the show delivered. We even had the thrill of seeing good old Dewey Phillips share the mic with Elvis for a while. Maybe there were some people around me who had just come to see Ferlin Husky, but I don't remember seeing a face that wasn't smiling at the end of Elvis's 4 or 5 song set. It felt like the first great meeting of a secret club. Being an Elvis fan at this point was a little unusual, but all of us unusual people had come together in downtown Memphis and felt the first life-changing rumble of rock and roll's Big Bang. We walked out of that auditorium absolutely knowing that we'd been witnesses to the start of something new and explosive. Elvis wasn't going to just be a voice on the radio or records anymore. He was out in the real world, and, to those of us who welcomed him, that world began to look and sound like a much more exciting place. The usual reactions to Elvis weren't as positive. A crowd of supporters was regularly coming to watch Elvis play ball at the park, but almost every Sunday there'd also be cars full of guys driving by the park just for the chance to heckle him, with something along the lines of pretty boy being the insult of choice. I'd also heard that a couple of times guys had blindsided Elvis, pretending to come up to him for an autograph and then taking a swing at him when they got close enough, or calling him over to a car for an autograph, throwing a punch, and then driving away. Occasionally, carloads of young sailors from the Millington Naval Base north of Memphis would make the trip to Guthrie just to drive past and yell, "Hey, sideburns!" at the degenerate rock and roller they'd heard about. Incidents like that led Elvis to rely more and more on guys like Red West to stick around him and play some real-life defense for him.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.
At one of our bigger games in the spring of 1955, we'd been playing for a while when a couple of very large men showed up and asked if they could get in the game. They explained that they were semi-pro players, had heard about the Elvis games, and wanted to be a part of it. The rest of us were not so eager to play with these big guys, but as far as Elvis was concerned, these players were stepping onto his turf, and he wasn't going to stand down. He wanted them in. We worked out the teams again to include them and got set to play. On one of the first offensive drives, Elvis was taking a break from quarterbacking duties and was on the line blocking. When the ball was snapped, this 200-pound-plus semi-pro hit Elvis hard and ran right over him. Elvis took his time getting up. He was obviously a little shaken. Now, we played tough at these games, with all-out effort, and we regularly knocked the hell out of each other. But the point was that everybody got knocked around. Nobody ever specifically targeted Elvis. You wouldn't think twice about hitting him if that's the way the play went, but nobody was ever going out of their way to try to hurt him. From the look of that semi-pro player's first hit, it seemed that maybe these guys weren't so interested in playing ball for fun. They were going to teach pretty boy Presley a lesson. As we got back into a huddle, it was clear that Red West was furious. "I'll take that son of a bitch out," he said. "No, Red," said Elvis sharply. "Damn it, no. Just play the game." We ran a few more plays, and it was the same thing each time. Elvis got a tremendous hit from this charging rhino. But Elvis made a point of hopping up a little faster each time and just shaking it off. It got to a point where the day just didn't feel like fun anymore. All the regular players were furious, and we were all telling Elvis that the game couldn't go on like this, but he wouldn't hear it. He wanted to play through. I found myself lined up next to Elvis with the same big guy ready to charge at him again. "Hit me from the left side," said Elvis. "What?" asked the rhino. "Hit me from the left side." "Why?" "I got a few bones over there that ain't broke yet," said Elvis. The big guy started laughing, and by the time the ball was snapped, he was laughing hard enough that he didn't have the strength to steamroll Elvis. After the play, we took a break, and the guy went over to his fellow rhino. In a few minutes, they walked back toward Elvis. Now the big guys were all smiles. "Excuse me, Elvis," said the one who'd been knocking him down. "We sure did enjoy the game. Hope there aren't any hard feelings." Red was still ready to lunge at them, but Elvis just shrugged. "No hard feelings," said Elvis. "Just bruises. Good luck with your season." Their big faces lit up like they'd just been blessed by the Pope. They started to walk away when the guy who had been knocking Elvis down turned around and came back. Just one more thing, Elvis. Our wives are over there. Can we bring them over to meet you?" "Sure," said Elvis. "Bring them over." As Elvis signed autographs for their wives, it all came together for me. If he had let Red and the rest of us go after these guys, then he would have ended up with some more enemies. Instead, he took a little punishment and ended up with 4 new fans. There were a lot of people in Memphis that wanted to knock Elvis down, figuratively and literally, but what I saw happen on that field with the semi-pro guys was something I'd witness over and over again. A lot of people thought they had something against Elvis, but I never saw anybody who spent any time with him walk away not liking him. As my 8th grade year started in the fall of 1955, I felt a bit like I was living in 2 worlds. There was school, home, and everything in the ordinary world. Then there were Sundays at Guthrie Park. One day early in the school year, the worlds collided. I was out on the playground behind the school during lunchtime, not doing much of anything. I'd become more careful about playground ball games since one of my football passes had knocked the headwear off a very startled nun. When I heard the roar of a motor coming down Woodlawn Street, I looked toward the street and saw a vehicle that would have turned heads anywhere, but certainly stood out around Holy Names, a big, beautiful pink Cadillac. In the driver's seat was Elvis, steering with one arm on top of the steering wheel. I was surprised and very happy to see him pull a quick left on Looney Avenue, the street that bordered the Holy Names playground, and pull up to the curb. "Hey, man," Elvis called out. Didn't seem like there was any other Holy Names grade schooler he could possibly be calling to. I took a couple of steps toward him. He had gotten out of the car and was leaning against it, drumming his fingers on the hood and peering past me at the school. I could sense that the playground behind me had become a little quieter. "Hey, Elvis, what are you doing over here?" "Just came from Hume's, seeing how the place is holding up." Elvis smiled past me and waved at somebody. I heard giggles. I was standing just yards away from first graders and hopscotch grids, racking my brain for something to say that would make me sound solid, older, just a little bit cool. "I heard your shows are going great." Elvis let loose a laugh. "Yeah, well, we're just having some fun." We stood there a few more moments, not talking about much of anything. He kept smiling past me, and I kept hearing those giggles. He slapped at the car hard and spun away. "Gotta go. See you later, Chief," said Elvis. "See ya at the next game," I said. He went back around the car, flung open the driver's door, and just before climbing in, gave a casual wave to the playground. I heard more giggles behind me. Elvis came by Holy Names a few more times that fall, and I was always proud of the fact that I was the kid Elvis came over to talk to. Years later, it occurred to me that while, from my perspective, those playground visits were about me and Elvis, from his perspective, the visits served another purpose. Holy Names was a boys and girls grade school, but an all-girls high school. For those of us too young to go out to the likes of the Eagle's Nest, the coolest music you could hear was at the Holy Names high school dances on Saturday nights. Elvis's first girlfriend had been from Holy Names, and during his time at Hume's, he went to plenty of those Holy Names dances. The grade school and the high school were in two separate brick buildings on the same lot, but they shared the same playground. The point is, when Elvis pulled up to that curb, he wasn't thinking about talking to me. He was thinking about checking out a playground full of Catholic high school girls. Just across Thomas Avenue from the perilous Hurt Village was a little shotgun shack that had been turned into a hamburger joint and candy store called The Stand. It was just a couple of blocks away from Holy Names, but it felt like a tougher part of town, and I liked the feel of walking over there to get my lunch. On a chilly March afternoon in 1956, I was in The Stand, about to pull the cap off a bottle of Coke with the built-in opener on the big metal pop machine in there, when a new song started playing on the jukebox. The voice was unmistakable. Rich, confident, soft and strong at the same time. It was Elvis, singing a new song called I Was the One. She lived, she loved, she laughed, she cried. I was used to hearing Elvis rock, but here was an Elvis song that grabbed me in a whole different way. It went straight for the emotions and hit like a fist to the gut. I had recently been dumped by my first girlfriend, Loretta Cucci, a real looker from Holy Names' rival school, Little Flower, and here was Elvis singing out all those tangled feelings that I hadn't been able to put into words. Who learned the lesson when she broke my heart? I was the one. That was exactly what I wanted to tell Harry Vaughn, the tough Golden Gloves champ my girl had moved on to. I stood frozen at the Coke machine until the song was over. A beautiful tune, packed full of truth, sung from the heart. I took a swig of my Coke and went back to my burger over at the counter. It occurred to me that Elvis Presley wasn't just getting by on cool. This guy could really sing. A few days later at the Stand, I heard the A-side of the I Was the One single, a song called Heartbreak Hotel. If the B-side had grabbed me, the A-side just blew me away. With Heartbreak Hotel, Elvis seemed to be inventing his own kind of music from scratch. That song didn't sound like anything else on the jukebox. It rocked, but it was haunting, too. When Elvis sang Feel So Lonely in that odd, hiccupy way, it cut right through you. And I wasn't the only one blown away by the song. Within a few weeks, it was at the top of the pop charts, giving Elvis his first #1 hit. I wasn't following record label politics back in 1956, but the release of Heartbreak Hotel marked Elvis's debut as an RCA recording artist, having moved on from Sun Records and producer Sam Phillips. The usual line on Sam is that he discovered Elvis, but that doesn't quite give Sam credit for the care and guidance he applied to the young singer. Elvis showed up at Sun Studio wanting to croon ballads. The first thing he recorded there was the sweet, non-rocking My Happiness. Elvis thought that was the kind of tune serious singers were supposed to sing. Sam's ear picked up on the potential in Elvis's voice, and he encouraged the young singer to break away from the standard pop approach. When you go back and listen to Good Rockin' Tonight or Mystery Train, there's both an excitement and a mystique to the sound that still holds up after decades of listens. The music Sam encouraged and captured in the humble, no-frills storefront of Sun Records still sounds extraordinary. Sam is supposed to have said, "If I could find a white boy who could sing like a black man, I could make $1 million. The quote has sometimes been referred to as if it were some kind of devious strategy on Sam's part, but if he did say anything close to that, it was simply a statement of fact about race and music in 1950s Memphis. Sam knew that there was a huge audience of white kids hungry for the excitement they heard on the black R&B records, and he also knew that, given the deep-seated anger and fear that white society had when it came to matters of race, it was going to take a white voice with a black feel for the music to ever fully cross over. But I think people forget how much Sam loved R&B, and what a fearless pioneer he was in putting all his energies into making great records for artists like Rufus Thomas, Howlin' Wolf, Ike Turner, and B.B. King. Today, those artists are seen as brilliant talents, and Sun Records has achieved respected iconic status. But back when Sam Phillips was spending long nights in that little storefront studio with groups of black musicians, he was doing something that made him a target for the most vicious kinds of personal attacks. Sam didn't spend the roughest years of his life recording all those great black artists wishing they were white. His passion for exciting music was stronger than any regard for color lines or a sensible career path, and his dedication to that music and those artists made him a despised outcast to much of the Memphis business community. It's hard for anyone looking at the music world today to imagine what he went through, but to stand up and do what he did makes him, at least to me, rock and roll's ultimate hero. I had a chance to see Elvis perform again over at the Chiska Hotel in March of 1956, after I heard about a special show Dewey Phillips was putting on in the hotel's basement lounge, the Chickasaw Ballroom. Elvis was performing as a special guest with the Cy Rose Band. I dragged my old witness, Frankie Grisanti, along with me to see Elvis in action, promising him that, after what I'd seen at Ellis Auditorium, it would be worth the trip downtown. But when we got to the Chiska, we ran straight into a major obstacle. Alcohol was going to be served in the ballroom, and tickets were not being sold to minors. I'd spent enough time crawling through the sewer pipes of North Memphis for Saturday kicks to know that there was usually more than one way to get where you wanted to get. So Frankie and I backed away from the main entrance to the Chickasaw and casually slipped into a service hallway. We snuck around past laundry chutes and water heaters until we got to a little area around the other side of the ballroom, a hallway with a big soda machine and a door that led right to the stage. We watched as much of the first show as we could through the crack in that door, but the biggest thrill came after Elvis finished his first show, when he headed off stage right toward us. We scattered from the door just as he came through. He was sweating something fierce and a little out of breath, looking like he'd gotten a more intense workout than he did at any of the football games. I don't know if he nodded at us or if he was just getting his hair back in place, but he acted like it was the most natural thing in the world for Frankie and me to be in that basement hallway. There wasn't a place to sit, so he just leaned up against one of the big basement pillars. "Give me a Pepsi, would you?" "Sure, Elvis." I brought him the cold bottle, and he tipped his head back and chugged away. The sweat was just pouring off of him. And I remember noticing that, as sharp as he looked in his black pants and red jacket, he still had a bad patch of acne on his neck. He was human. Elvis didn't say much to Frankie and me, but he seemed perfectly comfortable to have us around. We hung around for the whole break between shows, and after a while there were other people around who wanted to talk to Elvis. He talked to them, but if he wanted another Pepsi, he got it from me or Frankie. The moment seemed special because it wasn't special, just him and us, standing around drinking soda. He had just walked away from a screaming audience to stand out here in the hallway. Frankie and I were in the hallway, and it was no big deal. But it was. At the Ellis Auditorium, I'd gotten the sense that something really big and exciting was happening around Elvis. Now, standing close to the guy, working the soda machine in the Chiska Hotel basement, I started feeling that, in some small way, I was a part of what was happening. Down south, when I was growing up, the most common summer vacation was to get the family piled in a car and drive down to Florida. My dad was a big advocate for Florida vacations. He felt that if he could get down there for a couple of weeks and spend as much time as possible in the salt water, it would keep him healthy throughout the year. An August trip to Miami became his annual vacation, and, come to think of it, I don't actually remember him getting sick very often. In August of 1956, we loaded up his Pontiac for the trip to Miami, leaving room for 4 passengers. He was also bringing along his girlfriend Lula, who would eventually become my stepmother, and one of their mutual friends, a lady named Helen. I wasn't especially thrilled to be part of this quartet, but I did look forward to the adventure of a trip out of town. On our way into Miami, we drove past a Lincoln dealership, and I spotted something that made the trip suddenly much more worthwhile. As Elvis's fortunes had risen, he had quickly bumped up from his pink Caddy to a yellow Cadillac convertible with a Continental kit, and then to his latest ride, a brand-new purple white-top Lincoln Premier. And passing that dealership, I spotted Elvis's purple Lincoln sitting in the showroom window, sporting an unusual detailing job. The car was covered with love messages and phone numbers written in lipstick. Elvis was in town. In Miami, we checked into a not-too-pricey hotel that was within walking distance of the fancier Fontainebleau, where my dad and his female companions would hit the nightly dances. The three of them had plans for how they were going to spend their days and nights, and my dad didn't pressure me to be a part of that group. I was trusted to take in Miami on my own. On the first day there, while the others were out getting some sun, I stayed next to the radio until I got the information I was after. Elvis was going to be performing in Miami at the Olympia Theater over the next couple of days. I had seen him that July 4th, playing his biggest concert in Memphis to date, packing 7,000 fans into the Russwood Park ball field, but hadn't seen him around much after that. I knew he was taking his own summer Florida trip, doing a string of theater dates during which he'd perform 3 or 4 times a day, and when this Florida tour was over, he was heading out to Hollywood to start work on his first feature film. I can't remember if I had to twist my dad's arm much to get me a ticket to one of the Olympia shows, or if he just figured we should do at least one special father-son thing while we were away, but he and I ended up with a pair of tickets to a Saturday afternoon Elvis performance. I'd felt a little lost in the crowd at the Russwood show, so it was great to see Elvis perform in a small theater this time. Even on a little stage for a smaller audience, he didn't hold anything back. Even before a note of music was played, he had the crowd going wild. He took the stage almost casually, walking out like that tiger again, knowing he could take his time before going in for the kill. He strolled right up to the corner edge of the stage, grabbed the curtain, and leaned out right over the audience. The girls went wild. He pulled himself back, walked over to his spot behind the mic, and then snapped into action as the band kicked in. When the crowd went even wilder, he feigned a moment of surprise, like he couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. Then a little devilish smile flashed across his face, almost as though he were smiling at himself. Elvis certainly wasn't a Memphis secret anymore at this point. He'd been seen by a national television audience on Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey's stage show, The Milton Berle Show, and The Steve Allen Show, and his first album, Elvis Presley, the one with his name in pink and green letters, had shot to #1 on the pop charts. But with all his success, Elvis was also starting to get a lot of negative attention from the national press. The New York Daily News had decried Elvis's grunt and groin antics. The New York Times announced that he had no discernible singing ability, and the Catholic weekly America called him downright obscene. With all that coming down on him, however, he wasn't going to change a thing about his show. On that little Miami theater stage, he was as unhinged and exciting as he'd been at Ellis, putting everything he had into his performance, and again grabbing and dragging that mic around in a way that the Holy Name's nuns would certainly not approve of. I'm not sure what my father, a big band fan, made of it all, but I think I got him to at least concede that the music had a solid, danceable beat. Elvis got a huge reaction out of 2 of his newest songs, Don't Be Cruel, and his big closer, Hound Dog. Both would be #1 hits through the rest of the summer. It was a heck of a jump for popular music to go from How Much Is That Doggy in the Window to Hound Dog in just a few years, but Elvis led us there fearlessly, and at this performance left us begging for more. But at these kinds of shows, Elvis did only about a half hour of material, and the theater management wanted to turn the crowd over pretty fast. When Elvis finished and the curtains closed and the screams started to die down, my father got up to go. Before we headed out, I spotted Red West over by the side of the stage. I went over to say hello, and Red told me what hotel they were staying at, and that they were leaving late that night to head for more shows in Tampa. He also explained that Elvis had driven into town in the purple Lincoln, but as soon as it was discovered outside his hotel by fans, it was thoroughly and lovingly defaced in the lipsticked manner we'd seen. Elvis had traded it in at the dealership we saw for a brand-new white Lincoln Continental Mark II. That night, my dad and the ladies went out for another night of dancing at the Fontainebleau, and a couple of hours later I headed out on the town with a different musical incentive. I wandered a while before I came around a corner and knew instantly that I was in the right place. There was a small throng of excited girls clustering around something in front of a big building, and the closer I got, the more I could just about make out the outline of a shiny white Lincoln beyond the girls. I started milling around the edge of the crowd, feeling almost overcome by the smell of so many competing perfumes. The girls were desperately trying to edge each other out, but somehow they let little me slip through, and pretty soon I was close enough to see Elvis leaning against the Lincoln, apparently trying to sign as many autographs as he could before he left town. I always felt a little pang of insecurity when I hadn't seen Elvis for a while. Would our friendship pick up wherever it had left off, or had he just gotten too big, too busy? I was starting to feel that pang now, when suddenly a few girls in front of me moved to the side, and there I was, standing just a few feet away from Elvis. He had autograph albums and pictures being shoved in front of him, and dozens of very attractive girls bobbing all around him, and there's no reason a 14-year-old boy should have caught his attention. But he saw me, and stopped signing whatever he was signing. He squinted for a moment, like he wanted to make sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. Then he said, "Jerry, what in the hell are you doing here?" I didn't have a chance to tell him much before the girls closed in again, but it didn't matter. In the middle of all these crazy strangers, I was a guy he knew by name. Chapter 3. Midnight Rambles. After September 9, 1956, it was hard to believe that there was anyone left in the United States who wasn't aware of Elvis Presley. That was the night he appeared on the season premiere of The Ed Sullivan Show. Sullivan was recuperating from injuries suffered in a recent car accident, so Elvis's debut performance on the show was introduced by a surprising guest host, actor Charles Laughton. Laughton was hosting the show in New York City, but Elvis's segments were broadcast from the CBS studios in Los Angeles, where he was working on his first movie. Elvis sang Don't Be Cruel, Ready Teddy, Hound Dog, and a song from the new film called Love Me Tender. In the days after the broadcast, newspapers were saying that 80% of American TV viewers had watched Elvis that night, and a huge national audience watched again when he returned to the show at the end of October. Sullivan was back hosting by that time. I watched those Sullivan shows with a great deal of excitement. It was almost unbelievable that a guy who had started as a local talent was now on the biggest TV show in America. And it was made a little more exciting by the fact that Sullivan had at one point said that he wouldn't ever have Elvis on the show. Elvis was just too controversial. After Elvis appeared on the Steve Allen Show and trounced Sullivan in the ratings, Sullivan changed his mind and welcomed Elvis. Even at the time, Elvis's Sullivan performances felt historic. You had to admit that the world was a different place after Elvis shook hands with Ed Sullivan at the end of that second show. But for me, his most memorable television moment had come back in January when Elvis made his first appearance on the Dorsey Brothers stage show. On that program, Elvis delivered a wild, untamed performance of Shake, Rattle, and Roll, but almost as powerful as the performance itself was just the way he walked out on stage when he was introduced. If you just saw that walk and turned the TV off before a note of music was played, you'd still get the message. This guy was sex, danger, and good times all rolled into one. I guess that message was clear to the Sullivan producers. During Elvis's first appearance, they had the cameras cut away from him when he began to dance during Ready Teddy. As big as Elvis had become, when he was back in Memphis, he still liked to play football. So, on a crisp, beautiful fall November day, We football regulars had our green jerseys on, and a crowd of spectators was fanned around the edges of the field at Guthrie Park. Elvis, quarterbacking as usual, seemed to be in a particularly good mood. There was just one problem. For the first time ever at a Guthrie game, I was having a hard time following what he was saying, and having an even harder time keeping my eyes on him as he sketched out our plays and pass patterns. As much as I'd been looking forward to this game while Elvis was away, now that I was here in the middle of a huddle, I was thoroughly distracted. Natalie Wood was standing on the sidelines. I had seen Rebel Without a Cause the year before, and just like a few million other adolescent boys, had developed a mad crush on the lovely, brown-eyed girl who jeopardizes her respectable standing by falling in love with the brooding James Dean. Elvis had met her while he'd been out in Hollywood shooting his own movie. Word was that Elvis and Natalie had dated a few times, and when Elvis asked her and his newfound Hollywood actor pal Nick Adams to come with him for a few days of Memphis fun, they'd accepted the invitation. A bunch of the players and I had stood around the park for about half an hour after what had been the agreed-upon start time of the game that day, which was a little unusual because even though Elvis had his own schedule for just about everything else, he was always on time for football. Looking back, I think this was a day that he wanted to make an especially big entrance, which is exactly what he did, roaring up to the park in great rebel style on a huge, brand-new Harley-Davidson motorcycle. And it made perfect sense that on the back of that motorcycle, clinging tightly to the driver, was a female passenger. It was only after that passenger dismounted and shook her hair out that I realized who I was looking at, and right away I felt my stomach twisting up and my knees getting shaky. I suppose that after hanging around Elvis so much, I should have known how to handle being in the presence of a celebrity, but with Elvis, I'd had the chance to know him as a regular guy before he'd gone on to be a local phenomenon and then a full-fledged star. I'd had some time to process the strange way in which a flesh-and-blood human becomes a famous face. But Natalie Wood seemed to have stepped right out of the movies and onto that field, and I had no idea how to make sense of that. She seemed at once incredibly petite and also too big to be standing under a North Memphis sky. Either way, she was absolutely stunning, and I couldn't keep my eyes off of her. Catching an Elvis pass was one thing, but Natalie Wood on the back of Elvis's motorcycle? That was pretty exciting stuff for a day in the park. "Come on, Jerry, look alive. Don't let him get past you on a plain old slant." Elvis was not happy with our defense. The guys lining up against us kept having success with the long ball, and since I was playing back in the secondary, that was my responsibility. Of course, I didn't tell Elvis I was distracted by his imported cheerleader. I also didn't tell him that I was having some trouble getting any kind of support from my partner in the secondary, Nick Adams. Adams had also been in Rebel Without a Cause and was getting steady work in features like Picnic and Our Miss Brooks. He was a little guy who looked like he could probably move with some speed when he wanted to, and Elvis had insisted that the actor side up with our team, but it was clear that Nick did not approach competitive athletics with anything near the kind of intensity that Elvis did. Not only did he never break a sweat, he's the only guy I've ever seen reading a newspaper while playing cornerback. I eventually got my head in the game enough to bat down a few passes on defense and make a few catches on offense, but I never quite forgot that a Hollywood beauty was just a few yards away at the side of the field. At the end of the game, Elvis and Natalie stood together, and a few of the guys went up and said hello to her. I didn't go anywhere near them. I loved Natalie within the safe, dark confines of the Rialto movie theater, but the idea of actually talking to her was a little too much. The crowd of spectators that the Guthrie games drew sometimes made it difficult for Elvis to make as quick an exit as he liked, and this was a day when he used one of his rather ingenious escape maneuvers. Standing with Natalie, He casually pulled a comb from his pocket and began to work it through his hair. Then, in equally casual manner, he tossed the comb out on the field. When a cluster of the most avid fans surged out on the grass to try and grab up the souvenir, Elvis and Natalie darted the other way, toward the waiting Harley, and sped off down Chelsea Avenue. Hollywood had come to North Memphis. And a few weeks later I got to witness North Memphis returning the favor. On November 21, I was at the Lowe State Theater as part of one of the first paying audiences to get a look at Elvis Presley's debut feature film, Love Me Tender. The screams of the girls around me made it just about impossible to follow the story. This was the first time I'd ever seen an audience treat a film like it was a live concert, loudly responding to every move made and word uttered by their favorite star. I concentrated as best I could on watching the movie. I'd sat in that same theater just a month before on a school field trip to see The 10 Commandments. That epic film had a tremendous, enduring impact on me. I didn't see how anything on screen could be bigger or better, but I'd never played football with Charlton Heston. Watching Love Me Tender, I saw Elvis, someone I knew pretty well, holding his own up on the same big screen where Moses had worked miracles. I was watching Elvis play a character, but at the same time I could recognize a whole lot of the guy I'd played football with. Between seeing Natalie Wood off the screen and Elvis up on it, I felt I was starting to understand some of the mystery of the movies. The people up on screen were real people doing a job. And at the Lowe's, Elvis was doing his job pretty darn well. As Elvis began his film career, he was taking a step closer to mainstream American entertainment, but he was still seen by many as a dangerous element in American society. That split was made very clear during Elvis's third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in January of 1957. Elvis had become an even more controversial figure after his first two appearances, but Sullivan didn't flinch from having him back. However, a concession was made to the moral outrage that Elvis had stirred up. When he performed this time, he was only filmed from the waist up. As with most acts of censorship, this only made its target even more exciting. But in a way, Elvis was already way ahead of the cameras. On TV now, he was not the wild, untamed performer I'd seen on the Dorsey Brothers show. He was having fun, but he was also clearly determined. As much as the camera tried to contain him, he'd already figured out how to look right through that lens and reach a TV audience with the smallest of gestures. Here was a performer so dangerous that we couldn't see his whole body, and yet, at the end of the show, Ed Sullivan did something very surprising, announcing to his huge American TV audience, "I just wanted to say to Elvis Presley and the country that this is a real, decent, fine boy," and going on to say that he'd never had a more pleasant experience dealing with a big-name guest. The way Elvis looked out at us at that moment, I thought I could see a mix of hurt over the attacks he'd been subjected to in the press, and a deep pride in who he was and what he was doing. In some ways, rebel is the perfect word for Elvis. Just by being who he was and making the music he wanted to make, he was taking on the musical and social conventions of the day. But rebel doesn't get all of it. The word can feel too negative, and you have to be against something to stage a rebellion. On a personal level, Elvis was not fired up with anger and negativity. He wasn't raging against the world he saw around him. He was fired up with a passion for great music that happened to come from both black and white experiences, and he simply wasn't going to let the world around him get in the way. As far as those early days go, I think pioneer and trailblazer fit Elvis as much as rebel does. While Elvis was still a teenager, he was being told that he was a corrupter of youth and a traitor to his race. But rather than answering with any kind of "screw you," he handled it all with dignity and humility, a manner that could come only from an inner strength. As his career started to pick up, when he really started to get to the point where he had something to lose, he had the strength of purpose to casually step over the color lines in Memphis, turning up, for example, as a respectful white face in an all-black audience at WDIA's annual Goodwill Review Gala concert. When he was brought out on stage by Rufus Thomas to say hello to the crowd, he received a warm and enthusiastic ovation. Despite lingering notions to the contrary, the black population of Memphis got what Elvis was doing and knew what he was up against, and he deeply appreciated their support. The way Elvis handled his fame in the early years tells you a lot about his character. By early 1957, Elvis was successful enough that he could have said goodbye to Memphis forever and become a permanent resident of a Beverly Hills mansion. He'd moved on from his role in Love Me Tender to a starring role in Loving You. In the spring, he had another #1 hit with All Shook Up, and then he was back out to Los Angeles to star in his third film, Jailhouse Rock. But Memphis was home, and home meant everything to Elvis, so he was very excited when he found a beautiful place just south of downtown that he felt might make a perfect Memphis home for him, his mom and dad, and his grandmother. A place called Graceland. I stood in front of a custom-built gate decorated with an iron guitar and music notes, peering up the gentle sloping hill of oak trees to the grandest structure I'd ever laid eyes on. The impressive stone facade, the huge colonial pillars, the welcoming portico. Oh, this was a long way from Lauderdale Courts, and I was a long way from Leith Street. After finishing 8th grade at Holy Names, I'd ended up at Catholic High School out in Midtown Memphis, not too far from Overton Park. There had been a brief detour at Christian Brothers College, the school my brother had attended, but I felt miserable and out of place there. Billy Ray, again stepping up to his big brother duties, suggested to my father that I'd be a lot happier and better off at Catholic High. I did have a good first year there, and I also got used to exploring a wider circle of Memphis, riding the bus, hitchhiking, or, when I could get it, driving Dad's Pontiac. So, on a fine summer day, I had decided to head down Highway 51 to check out Graceland. The gates I stood at had clearly gone up for a reason. There was a group of fans, mostly girls, clustered around the entrance, chatting away and showing off pictures and autographs to each other. Elvis and his family had been in the house for only a few months, but already these fans seemed like they were very comfortable just spending a day at the edge of the property, hoping they might catch sight of Elvis coming or going. They were inspired by Elvis and wanted some way to get closer to him. I could certainly understand that. At this point, Elvis was out of town more than he was in Memphis, but these fans were on top of the Elvis schedule enough to know when he was up at the house. Through Red West and some of the other football guys, I'd become friendly with George Klein. George was a Humes classmate of Elvis's, and though the two had not been close while in high school, their paths had continued to cross as Elvis's music career took off and George headed off on a radio career. He had learned the business hanging around Dewey Phillips, and went on to become a top DJ in his own right, also one of the very first to play Elvis's records. George was a strong, early enthusiastic supporter of Elvis, and out of their professional contact, a real friendship grew. As a rock and roll DJ back then, George had a cool and a toughness all his own. He was a sharp, solid guy who had an almost superhuman knowledge of everything going on in popular music. His family had actually lived on Leith Street for a while, and my mother had babysat for him when he was small. He was an Elvis inner circle guy that I considered very approachable. I don't remember him playing much football, but he came to a lot of the Guthrie games, and our own friendship began to develop. Through George, I heard that Elvis was starting to have people up at the house. That's what had brought me to the gate. Just behind the brick columns on the right side of the gate was a small guardhouse which was being manned by an older guy with the strong chin and great hair of the Presley clan. This, I would learn, was Uncle Vester, brother of Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, who had already been assigned the gatekeeper position that he would hold for many years. I gathered up my courage and signaled to him. I cleared my throat and hoped that I could keep my voice low without having it crack the way it had been doing lately. "My name is Jerry Schilling. I was wondering if I could go up to the house, if it's all right." Vester eyed me for a moment. "Jerry, is it?" he asked. "Yes, sir, Jerry Schilling." Vester ambled over to the guardhouse and picked up a phone. I couldn't hear what was said, but a minute later, the gate started to swing open. The crowd of fans began to buzz with excitement, but they knew the drill well enough not to try to swarm through the open gate. I think I remember a few startled breaths when the group realized that I was the one who was being granted access, and to be honest, I was a little startled myself. Vester waved me up the long driveway, and I headed up the hill. I was excited and a little anxious to be on Elvis's property, headed for his home. But as soon as I stepped into the dappled shadows of those oak trees, I was hit with a feeling that was quite unusual for me. Peacefulness. There was a calm and tranquility that seemed to be part of the air around Graceland, and I couldn't help but relax, breathe a little deeper, and walk a little easier. About halfway up the drive, I realized that there was a figure coming toward me. There was the Presley chin and the hair again, but this time it was Vernon. I was struck by the fact that Vernon had an easy walk that looked very familiar to me. He seemed to have adopted Elvis's unique, loping, shoulder-rolling manner of strolling, even keeping one arm at his belt, just the way Elvis did. Later I would mention to Billy Ray how strange it was that the dad would copy his son's walk. Billy Ray asked if I had considered that maybe Elvis had gotten the walk from his dad. Frankly, I hadn't considered that. It seemed to me that everything in the world keyed on Elvis. But Billy Ray was right, and Vernon deserves credit for the distinctive Presley walk. "Vester let you up?" Vernon asked. The voice was a little rougher around the edges, but had the same warm lilt as his son's. "Yes, sir." "Go ahead, then. Elvis is down. All the boys are downstairs." I'd soon learn that at Graceland, Elvis was either upstairs, seeking privacy in the bedroom and office that took up most of the second floor of the house, or he was down, ready and willing to spend time with visitors. I walked past a pair of cement lions guarding the walkway to the house and stepped past the magnificent columns to the front door. It'd be great to say that Elvis was right there at the door welcoming me in, but it would be a lie. I'm not sure who walked me into Graceland on that first visit. All I know is that in taking that first step into that incredible home, I felt like I was stepping into a place better than anything I could have dreamed up. To me, a really nice house was one that had fairly fresh paint and a bedroom for each kid living there. I had no idea that a house could be a thing of overwhelming beauty, but that's what I took in as soon as I was over the Graceland threshold. There was a blue ceiling that gave the illusion of an indoor sky, impossibly white carpets, a stairway trimmed in gold, mirrors everywhere, and furnishings that looked fit for a palace. I followed the sounds of voices and music down a mirrored stairway to a pair of rooms that, even at first glance, struck me as just about any boy's vision of the ultimate secret clubhouse. To the left was a hangout room with low-slung sofas, a TV and record player set into the far wall, and what looked like a fully stocked soda fountain. The room became known as the TV room. A room to the right was dominated by a full-size, ornate pool table. Framed gold .45s created a one-of-a-kind molding at the top of the walls. The rooms weren't immense, but were big enough to comfortably hold the dozen or so people partying down there. I recognized a few faces right away. George Klein was there, and so was Billy Smith, one of Elvis's cousins, who was about my age and who'd become a speedy, wide-receiving regular at the football games. Alan Fortis was a friend of George's who'd recently started showing up at games. He was a sturdy, good-humored guy from Central High on the east side of town. Elvis liked him enough to give him a nickname derived from his short haircut and prominent appendages, hog ears. A few girls were sitting in the TV room, including Elvis's girlfriend, Anita Wood, a pretty, upbeat blonde who was often at our football games. She had caught Elvis's eyes as the co-host of a local TV show called Dance Party with Wink Martindale, and the two now seemed to be a pretty serious couple. There was also Patsy Presley, Elvis's double first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, their mothers were sisters. She was also about my age, a quiet, centered girl who proved that the Presley good looks translated very well to the female form. Maybe I got a hello or a nod from some of the other guests, but I know nobody made any big fuss about my arrival. Remember, even though we were in one of the biggest houses in Memphis, in the presence of the biggest star in the world, this was still essentially just a bunch of kids getting together. Our host was only 22. And like any bunch of young people hanging out, everything was informal and casual. Nobody made a big deal out of anything. The big deal was that we were all there. I spotted Elvis in the pool room. He was just lining up his next shot. He was smoking a cigarette, which he never did at the football games, and he had a great way of holding the cigarette in his teeth as he leaned over the table. As cool as he looked, he missed sinking a striped ball in a corner pocket. It didn't look like it fazed him, but with the bottom of his cue he gave a sharp poke to the guy standing behind him, his cousin, Gene Smith. "Oh, what's that for, cuz?" howled Gene. Elvis kept his eyes on the table, looking like he had no idea what Gene was fussing about. As he watched the other players take their shots, the intensity on his face never waned. He was home, relaxing with friends, but he still clearly played to win. Gene had served as Elvis's man Friday since the first records had taken off. Elvis and Gene were very close and had a great relationship. Sometimes it seemed that they spoke their own private language together. The funny thing about Gene was that, even though Elvis understood him, it was hard for anybody else to make sense of what he said. And early on, when Elvis started to get a sense of how precious his own time was and how many people wanted a piece of it, he put Gene in charge of access. If you wanted to talk business with Elvis, you had to talk to Gene first. And if you could handle Gene time, then Elvis knew you might be worth some of his own time. Gene rose to the challenge of his position with Elvis by adopting a more business-like appearance. He began to carry a briefcase. But the contents of the briefcase weren't often very business-oriented. It was more likely that Gene would be carrying around a doorknob, a pair of pliers, and a sandwich than any kind of Elvis-related paperwork. I recognized some of the other pool sharks. One was a very big fellow named Lamar Fike, who had met Elvis through George Klein. Lamar had spent time with Elvis out in Los Angeles while Elvis was working on Jailhouse Rock, and had quickly become a part of his inner circle. Lamar's natural facial expression was a scowl, but he had a dark, dry sense of humor that became more evident as you got to know him. Gene and Lamar were characters, but the fact was that just about everyone around Elvis was a character of some sort. You had to do something a little out of the ordinary to get his attention and make it worth his while to let you into his world. Elvis was a very young guy, suddenly caught up in the big business of the entertainment world, and the last thing he wanted was to spend time with business types. He was looking for people he could trust and people he could have fun with. I didn't want to disappoint him on either count. "Who's the wise guy that put that goddamn music on?" It was Elvis, calling loudly from the pool room to the TV room. He kind of sounded like he was joking, but his voice had an angry edge to it, an edge I hadn't heard ever before. All Shook Up was playing on the built-in record player in the corner of the TV room. "Get that crap off!" yelled Elvis, coming through the doorway. There was no doubt that he was really angry. It was a Graceland lesson I wouldn't forget. Elvis didn't like hearing his records played at his own parties. He was proud of his work, but it was just that, his work. He lived with his music outside of the house. He didn't need to hear it while he was trying to relax in his own basement. Both rooms went silent, and somebody scrambled over to the machine to put on another record. Apologies were mumbled. Elvis didn't yell again, but his mood remained darkened. And I quickly learned that when Elvis was in a dark mood, it put a chill in the room that everyone felt. He went back to the pool room and stood, staring down hard at the table. Voices in the TV room remained subdued, and there was no more of the easy laughter that had been tumbling around between conversations. Elvis looked like he was caught between the urge to chew somebody out and the desire to calm himself down. After a few minutes, he tossed his cue hard against the wall and headed toward the doorway. I was feeling a little disappointed that even though I'd made it into his house, I hadn't spoken a word to him. But as he passed me on the way to the stairs, he said, in a quiet, almost somber voice, "Come up again sometime, Jerry." That's all I needed. I'd be back. I started turning up at the Graceland gates whenever I knew Elvis was in town. Sometimes I was waved through by Uncle Vester, just the way I had been the first time. Other times, word came down that Elvis wasn't seeing anybody. Sometimes there was a lot of waiting at the gate before word either way came down. At least one time I was waved up to the house. It was always the house. Nobody in the know ever said Graceland. And ended up spending 40 minutes at the front door in the winter cold, waiting for somebody to remember to let me in. I know there were probably a lot of fans across the country who would have given anything just to be able to stand right outside that Graceland gate to catch a glimpse of the owner, even if they never got in. Many times the folks at the gate got more than a glimpse. If Elvis was in the right mood, he was happy to stop his car at the gate and roll down the window and sign a few autographs. For the people gathered at the gate, the big distinction was obviously between those who were allowed through and those who weren't. Occasionally a new face would get the okay to go up to the house, though those faces were almost always female. I think Vester kept Elvis apprised when there were pretty young ladies down the drive, and when Elvis was having people up, he didn't mind including some new, unfamiliar girls. I had the chance to get to know some of these fan friends pretty well. There was Sherry and Frances from Memphis, and Darlene and Eileen, who came all the way from Chicago. I even took Darlene out on a couple of dates. It was extremely rare that an unfamiliar guy would make it through the gate. Elvis had been put down or actually attacked enough times by strangers that he wasn't going to take any chances in his own home. I'd also seen an offhand, stupid comment from some guy at the football games suck the fun out of those days for Elvis. It was already becoming hard for Elvis to find time to relax, and he wasn't going to take a chance that a guy he couldn't trust would spoil his fun. Times up at the house in that period really did feel like a little stretch of paradise. Sometimes we hung around outside at a beautiful gazebo area off the side of the house where the trophy room is today. There was a bar out there that served up cold sodas and a carefully stocked jukebox that played the hits of the day. I'm not sure who loaded the records. Maybe someone from the jukebox company. But the problem was that the hits of the day always included a fair amount of Elvis tunes. Teddy Bear, Jailhouse Rock, and Don't were all #1 songs in late '57 and early '58, and the Loving You and Christmas albums were at the top of the charts. We became very careful about what song buttons we pressed. Graceland had, and still has, a look of luxury. But I can't stress enough the low-key, easy, good-natured feel of those early days there. There was cold Pepsi, play-to-win 8-ball games, a little dancing, a little teasing, and a lot of joking around. Of course, we didn't feel like we were being wholesome. This was life on the edge back then. We were staying up later than anybody else in town, in my case, certainly later than anybody else at Catholic High, and hanging out at the Inn place in Memphis. Elvis was still considered dangerous, and we were all willing to have a little of that danger rub off on us. The Graceland gatherings might be described as parties, but they never had the feeling of events. It was just a natural get-together of the people Elvis considered friends. And I think in a lot of ways, those days at Graceland were his way to catch up and enjoy the kind of good times and friendships that he hadn't had in high school, and that were extremely difficult to come by now that the world saw him as a star. In that regard, I don't think my youth ever counted against me in getting through those Graceland gates. I was 15, and Billy Smith and Patsy Presley were right around that age too, and I think Elvis liked having some young, innocent energy around him. Away from Graceland, he'd been catapulted into a grown-up world of burdens and responsibilities that he hadn't ever imagined when he first sang That's All Right in Sam Phillips's storefront studio. And I think that the chance to spend time with people like us, who didn't want anything from him but his friendship, was the real luxury that Graceland offered. I fit in pretty well with that crowd, but I made one significant misstep at one of the first parties I went to. I was standing with George Klein, GK, in the TV room when Elvis came over. He mentioned to George that he liked the way I played football. Swelling with pride, I said, "Well, my cousin is David Lawrence." Cousin David had been a star football player at Humes High, and I thought dropping the name might work in my favor. Elvis looked away, his expression blank. Not angry, just blank. Then he nodded and walked across the room to talk to somebody else. George had a stricken look on his face. He leaned in toward me and whispered, "David Lawrence and the guys like David Lawrence were the ones who gave Elvis a real hard time back in high school." I don't think I mentioned any branch of my family tree up there again, and it meant an awful lot when later that day Elvis waved me over with his cue stick to play a game of pool with him. Elvis was an incredibly active, physical guy, and sometimes the fun had to move off the estate property. Elvis was a big amusement park fan, but his profile had become so high that just stepping into a place like that would lead to an unmanageable mob scene. So he'd gotten in the habit of renting out the nearby Memphis fairgrounds after hours, hiring a park attendant or two to keep the place running, and bringing along groups of trusted companions for wild nights of rides on the Pippin, a huge wooden track roller coaster, collisions in the Dodgem cars, and unlimited Pronto pups, basically an irresistible corn dog on a stick. The saying goes that youth is wasted on the young, but I think that even back then I had a sense that I was a part of something magical. Not only were we friends with Elvis, we were getting to live out a kind of fantasy life along with him. It was like having that carnival in East of Eden all to ourselves. Occasionally, that living fantasy could toss up some frights. The very first time I went to the fairgrounds, I found myself lined up with the group to take a ride on the Pippin, which even in the 50s seemed old and rickety enough to add a little actual terror to every ride. Elvis got in the first car and had Anita Wood snuggle up close to him. Patsy Presley, Gene, and Billy Smith, and a few others got in the cars behind them. Those of us new to the fairground experience stood on the platform as the ride began and the cars started their slow climb over the first hill. Then, just as the cars were out of sight, the ride roared into action. We could see the shadows of the cars zigging and zagging and shooting around turns and making their 7-story climbs. We could hear continual yells of fear and excitement. But when the car finally came back around to the starting platform, we saw a heart-stopping sight. Anita Wood sat in the first car alone. Elvis had been thrown from the Pippin. Some of the girls around me screamed. The rest of us stood frozen in shock. And then, just before the horror of what had happened really grabbed a hold of us, we heard a tremendous laugh coming up the stairs behind us. We turned to see Elvis, grinning like a happy, misbehaving little kid. It was a trick I saw him pull almost every time he brought new people to the fairgrounds. He had figured out a spot at the top of the first hill where he could jump out just before the ride took off at top speed. Then he'd scale down and sneak around back. And every time he got a tremendous kick out of the looks of panic on everybody else's faces. Other nights we went out at the Rainbow roller rink, which Elvis would also rent for after-hour private get-togethers. The Rainbow was a pretty typical roller rink, with a mirrored ball over the center of the floor, mirrors up on the walls, flashing lights, and an organ providing a stream of skatable pop tunes. But again, there was something special and dream-come-true about having a place like that all to ourselves. And again, Elvis would let loose his daredevil streak and turn an activity that I'd always seen as kind of dull into something thrilling, if not outright scary. I can picture him in his leather jacket and rider's cap, organizing us into giant whips, which would spin around and pick up speed until the person at the end lost control and rocketed off. We might put on some knee pads and elbow pads, never helmets, and work up our own roller derby games. There was a last man standing type of thing where you'd try to take somebody down by skating into them. People took some pretty good shots at Elvis, and he took hard shots at everybody else, but more than likely he'd be the one still on wheels at the end of the game. Actually, I think he and Billy had some secret agreement worked out. More than once I saw somebody just about to take Elvis down when little Billy would come zooming out of nowhere and knock the threat right down on its ass. This was still good, clean fun. I don't remember anybody drinking anything stronger than root beer, but it was fun that left you sore the next morning. Over the years, the Rainbow was home to quite a few contusions, several chipped teeth, and even a couple of concussions. When the weather was nice enough through the fall and winter of 57 into 58, we'd still get a football game together. Though now we moved on from Guthrie Park to the lighted field at Whitehaven High School that Elvis rented for us to play night games. I can't say that Elvis and I actually got closer during these times, but I did start to feel that I was accepted, that he actually liked having me around. There was a smile he'd throw my way when I was the one on my ass at the Rainbow, or a way he'd bark out, "Jerry, come here," to show me something at the fairgrounds that just felt friendly and familiar. At the fairgrounds and the rink and the football games, I started to get a sense of the incredible energy and love of life he had. He could get crazy, silly, and unpredictable, too. An amazing blend of an amiable cockiness and an open-hearted sensitivity. The cockiness was clearly backed up by talent, but the sensitivity was the real surprise, and if you got to see even the slightest bit of it, you felt further drawn to the guy. Some of those late nights at the fairgrounds or the Rainbow seemed to go on forever. But actually that period of easy good times shot by very quickly. I got used to going a month or two, or 3, without seeing Elvis as he kept up his frenetic work schedule. In addition to his film and recording work, there were concert tours of the West Coast and Hawaii. At the beginning of 1958, word quickly spread that Graceland would be without its host for a much longer period. Elvis had been drafted. Elvis was not thrilled about becoming a GI, and yet whatever strings he might have been able to pull back then, he wasn't going to refuse to go. He felt he was no different from anybody else in that regard. The Army did allow Elvis a few months' deferment so that he could finish making King Creole, taking over a lead role that had first been developed for the late James Dean. Then, without much fanfare, Elvis shipped off to basic training in Texas. Did the government target Elvis specifically to try to shut down rock and roll? We won't ever know for sure. This much is certain. From 1954 to 1958, Elvis wasn't making speeches, but he was making a statement. And following his lead, young people were starting to have a voice with a melody and a rhythm to it. And that was heard as a powerful and frightening threat to the status quo. I know that when Elvis got his military haircut and headed off to boot camp, a lot of parents in Memphis and the rest of the country heaved a sigh of relief, and hoped that maybe now that boy and his music would just fade away. There were significant changes in Elvis's life and in my life while he was off in the Army. For him, the biggest change was a tragic one. His mother, Gladys, died of liver failure while he was in basic training. He was somewhat begrudgingly allowed time off to be with her in her final days. I never had the chance to meet Mrs. Presley, but it had always been clear just how much she meant to Elvis. For me, the changes were both highly positive and a little surprising. Suddenly, I wasn't just keeping up academically, I was excelling. And now I was a good enough football player to be a varsity starter and co-captain of the team, with a shot at a college scholarship. Football had brought me and Elvis together in the first place, and I think it was the combination of success on the field and my friendship with Elvis that thoroughly transformed me from that lost little Tonto and Mama's apple tree to a guy popular enough to be elected class president in my freshman, sophomore, and junior years, and vice president in my senior year. The friendship with Elvis gave me confidence, but it wasn't something I played on for popularity. Just as I'd held tight to my first Elvis Guthrie Park experiences, I kept my Elvis association very quiet all through high school. I think all of us who had been accepted into the inner circles around Elvis considered it a real honor, and all of us understood that what went on at Graceland or at the other outings wasn't something you used to boost your own status away from the house. We realized that the time we spent with Elvis was a good portion of the only private time he ever got, and we all felt a stake in protecting that privacy for him. I would never have considered saying to any classmates, "Oh yeah, I was up at Graceland last night," and I really don't think most of them ever realized that I was one of the lucky few who was riding the Pippin at 2 a.m. with Elvis Presley. Life was very different with Elvis away in the Army. Even though I was becoming a fairly big man on the Catholic High campus, I missed hanging out at Graceland, and the football field, and the Rainbow. I missed hanging out with Elvis and the guys. I went and saw King Creole a half-dozen times, and was again impressed with Elvis's talents. But having him 20 feet tall on a movie screen was just never as satisfying as getting hit by his Dodgem car at the fairgrounds. I also spent a lot of time listening to Elvis's records. I'd always enjoyed his music for the way it made me feel, but now I started listening harder to the feelings that Elvis had been putting into his songs. I went back again and again to that great first album, with his name in pink and green letters on the black and white cover, and really listened to what Elvis was doing. I'd always been grabbed hardest by Elvis's rockers, but now I was caught in the spell of some of the quieter tunes. I'll Never Let You Go, Little Darlin', and One-Sided Love Affair. I'd recognized the range and the power of Elvis's voice on I Was the One, but now I really thought about the feelings that had to be inside Elvis in order for him to use his voice the way he did. I listened countless times to his eerie cover of Blue Moon, thinking that nobody could sing that song that way unless they truly knew what loneliness felt like. I figured that somewhere along the line, he too must have been dumped by a young love like Loretta Cucci. True romance came my way during senior year. One-Sided Love Affair had pretty much summed up my love life until then, and I'd gotten used to falling for girls who were somehow unattainable. But at a local dance my senior year, I spotted a beautiful girl with auburn hair who was the wildest dancer out on the dance floor. I summoned my newfound confidence and walked up and introduced myself. Instead of a brush-off, I got an invitation to dance along. Her name was Carol Cook. She went to Central High, and she lived out in the well-to-do neighborhoods of East Memphis. She was also Jewish, and there were probably a good number of my Catholic High classmates who would have recoiled at that religious difference. But this was a case where my mixed-up, semi-rootless childhood came in handy. It never occurred to me to let somebody else's prejudice get in the way of my dancing with a pretty girl. The night wasn't all budding romance. There was a guy from Central High who felt he had a stronger claim to be Carol's dance partner, and the situation could not be resolved without some punches being thrown. The intruder ended up with a bloody nose, and I ended up with his blood all over my white dress shirt. I also ended up with Carol Cook, who took me back to her house and tenderly attempted to clean me up. She was obviously impressed with my heroic stand on the dance floor, and the more she dabbed at my shirt, the more hooked I felt. Suddenly that Elvis song, "I'll Never Let You Go, Little Darlin'," was making sense to me in a whole new way. It felt both strange and familiar to be standing at those Graceland gates again on a chilly March evening in 1960. Strange in that I wasn't the same little kid anymore, and I was sure Elvis had been through some changes of his own, but familiar in that I was just as excited to get through those gates as I'd ever been. After 2 years overseas, Elvis was home. It felt great to walk through that front door again, almost as if I were the one coming home. I immediately encountered a cluster of people off to the right in the living room. There were plenty of familiar faces around, and I met each smile with a smile, but my eyes went to the figure standing at the end of the room in a kind of fighting stance. Elvis, looking serious and formidable in a white karate gi and a black belt. He was in the process of putting on a martial arts demonstration. I'd soon learn that karate was a new passion that he had developed over in Germany. He had met a German karate expert who had given him intensive personal training in the physical and spiritual aspects of the discipline. Karate was still something entirely exotic and odd to most of us in Memphis, but Elvis had become a fiercely devoted student. Big Lamar Fike and a somewhat fidgety Gene Smith were standing a few paces in front of Elvis, and both were holding up a cushion from the white living room sofa. He checked their grips on the cushions, and positioned their hands so that the cushions were right in front of their faces. He stepped back and got into a sort of fighting crouch, with his arms out and his hands extended in front of him. Some of the spectators were still smiling, but Elvis stayed intently focused. He took 2 quick steps forward, shouted something, and leapt into the air, simultaneously kicking a foot into each cushion. The kicks were full force, but he had enough control to make contact with the cushions without hurting the faces behind them. That distinctively loose-limbed manner of his that turned up on the football field disappeared. His karate moves were executed precisely and emphatically. There was applause, and Elvis, still looking intense and focused, nodded our way. He spotted me. "Jerry, come here," he said, motioning me over. "Help me with something." That little moment felt huge. There was no slap on the back, no hello or how you been, just a "Jerry, come here." And with one gesture to join him on the snow-white carpet of the Graceland living room, I was right back in. He squared me off opposite him and began to slowly demonstrate how his kicks and punches would work against an opponent. He coached me a little on how to defend against a move, then would show a counter-move that would cut through the defense. I got the hang of a couple of blocking moves, and we gradually picked up speed and got closer to full-force strikes. We were going at it pretty good, and I started to feel proud that I was keeping up, blocking his punches and counter-punches. I was learning fast, but not quite fast enough. My wrestler's stance left me vulnerable to kick attacks, and Elvis faked a punch, spun, and then landed his leather boot in my groin, just barely making contact with my most delicate region. Thank God he'd studied hard enough to have the control he had, because if he had kicked any harder, I would have been writhing on the floor, hitting soprano notes. And as I stepped back to join the small living room crowd, I realized that, coming from Elvis, a kick in the groin was a lot more personal and heartfelt than a slap on the back.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.